Chapter 1. 30 minutes to Lichfield. Conn Maxwell, at the armor-glass front of the observation deck, watched the landscape rush out of the horizon and vanish beneath the ship, 10,000 feet down. He thought he knew how an hourglass must feel with the sand slowly draining out. It had been 6 months to Lichfield when the Miser lifted out of La Plata spaceport and he watched terror dwindle away. It had been 2 months to Lichfield when he boarded the city of Asgard at the port of the same name on Odin. It had been 2 hours to Lichfield when the Countess Dorothy rose from the airship dock at Storysend. He had had all that time, and now it was gone, and he was still unprepared for what he must face at home. 30 minutes to Lichfield. The words echoed in his mind as though he had spoken them aloud, and then, realizing that he never addressed himself as Sir, he turned. It was the first mate. He had a clipboard in his hand, and he was wearing a Terran Federation Space Navy uniform of 40 years, or about a dozen regulation changes, ago. Once Conn had taken that sort of thing for granted. Now it was obtruding upon him everywhere. 30 minutes to Lichfield, sir, the first officer repeated, and gave him the clipboard to check the luggage list. Valises, 2. Trunks, 2. Microbook case, 1. The last item fanned a small flicker of anger, not at any person, not even at himself, but at the whole infernal situation. He nodded. That's everything. Not many passengers left aboard, are there? You're the only one, first class, sir. About 40 farm labourers on the lower deck. He dismissed them as mere cargo. Lichfield's the end of the run. I know. I was born there. The mate looked again at his name on the list and grinned. Sure, you're Rodney Maxwell's son. Your father's been giving us a lot of freight lately. I guess I don't have to tell you about Lichfield. Maybe you do. I've been away for 6 years. Tell me, are they having labor trouble now? Labor trouble? The mate was surprised. You mean with the farm tramps? 10 of them for every job, if you call that trouble. Well, I noticed you have steel gratings over the gangway heads to the lower deck, and all your crewmen are armed. Not just pistols, either. Oh. That's on account of pirates. Pirates? Conn echoed. Well, I guess you'd call them that. A gang will come aboard, dressed like farm tramps, they'll have Tommy guns and sawed-off shark guns in their bindles. When the ship's airborne and out of reach of help, they'll break out their guns and take her. Usually kill all the crew and passengers. They don't like to leave live witnesses, the mate said. You heard about the Harriet Bairn, didn't you? She was transcontinent and overseas, the biggest contragravity ship on the planet. They didn't pirate her, did they? The mate nodded. 6 months ago, Blackie Police gang. There was just a tag end of a radio call, that ended in a shot. Time the air patrol got to her estimated position it was too late. Nobody's ever seen ship, officers, crew or passengers since. Well, great goo, isn't the government doing anything about it? Sure. They offered a big reward for the pirates, dead or alive. And there hasn't been a single case of piracy inside the city limits of Storysend, he added solemnly. The Calder Range had grown to a sharp blue line on the horizon ahead, and he could see the late afternoon sun on granite peaks. Below, the fields were bare and brown, and the woods were autumn-tinted. They had been green with new foliage when he had last seen them, and the wine melon fields had been in pink blossom. Must have gotten the crop in early, on this side of the mountains. Maybe they were still harvesting, over in the Gordon Valley. Or maybe this gang below was going to the wine pressing. Now that he thought of it, he'd seen a lot of cask staves going aboard at Storysend. Yet there seemed to be less land under cultivation now than 6 years ago. He could see squares of bracken and low brush that had been melon fields recently, among the new forests that had grown up in the past 40 years. The few stands of original timber towered above the second growth like hills. Those trees had been there when the planet had been colonized. That had been 200 years ago, at the beginning of the 7th century atomic era. The name Poictesme told that Romanticist movement, when they were rediscovering James Branch Cabell. Old Genji Gartner, the scholarly and half-piratical space rover whose ship had been the first to enter the Tri-System, had been devoted to the romantic writers of the pre-atomic era. He had named all the planets of the Alpha system from the books of Cabell, and those of Beta from Spencer's Fairy Queen, and those of Gamma from Rabelais. Of course, the camp village at his first landing site on this one had been called Storisend. 30 years later, Genji Gartner had died there, after seeing Storisend grow to a metropolis and Poictesme become a member republic in the Terran Federation. The other planets were uninhabitable except in airtight dome cities, but they were rich in minerals. Companies had been formed to exploit them. No food could be produced on any of them except by carniculture and hydroponic farming, and it had been cheaper to produce it naturally on Poictesme. So Poictesme had concentrated on agriculture and had prospered. At least, for about a century. Other colonial planets were developing their own industries. The manufactured goods the Gartner Tri-System produced could no longer find a profitable market. The mines and factories on Yugan and Koshche, on Britomart and Calidor, on Panurge and the moons of Pantagruel closed, and the factory workers went away. On Poictesme, the offices emptied, the farms contracted, forests reclaimed fields, and the wild game came back. Coming toward the ship out of the east, now, was a vast desert of crumbling concrete landing fields and parade grounds, empty barracks and toppling sheds, airship docks, stripped gun emplacements and missile launching sites. These were more recent, and dated from Poictesme's second hectic prosperity, when the Gartner Tri-System had been the advance base for the 3rd Fleet Army Force, during the System States War. It had lasted 12 years. Millions of troops were stationed on or routed through Poictesme. The mines and factories reopened for war production. The Federation spent trillions on trillions of sols, piled up mountains of supplies and equipment, left the face of the world cluttered with installations. Then, without warning, the System States alliance collapsed, the rebellion ended, and the scourge of peace fell on Poictesme. The Federation armies departed. They took the clothes they stood in, their personal weapons, and a few souvenirs. Everything else was abandoned. Even the most expensive equipment had been worth less than the cost of removal. The people who had grown richest out of the war had followed, taking their riches with them. For the next 40 years, those who remained had been living on leavings. On Terra, Conn had told his friends that his father was a prospector, leaving them to interpret that as one who searched, say, for uranium. Rodney Maxwell found quite a bit of uranium, but he got it by taking apart the warheads of missiles. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Now he was looking down on the granite spines of the Calder Range. Ahead the misty Gordon Valley sloped and widened to the north. 20 minutes to Litchfield, now. He still didn't know what he was going to tell the people who would be waiting for him. No, he knew that, he just didn't know how. The ship swept on, 10 miles a minute, tearing through thin puffs of cloud. 10 minutes. The Big Bend was glistening redly in the sunlit haze, but Litchfield was still hidden inside its curve. 6. 4. The Countess Dorothy was losing speed and altitude. Now he could see it, first a blur and then distinctly. The airline's building, so thick as to look squat for all its height. The yellow block of the distilleries under their plume of steam. High Garden Terrace, the mall. Moment by moment, the stigmata of decay became more evident. Terraces empty or littered with rubbish, gardens untended and choked with wild growth, blank staring windows, walls splotched with lichens. At first, he was horrified at what had happened to Litchfield in 6 years. Then he realized that the change had been in himself. He was seeing it with new eyes, as it really was. The ship came in 500 feet above them all, and he could see cracked pavements sprouting grass, statues askew on their pedestals, waterless fountains. At first he thought one of them was playing, but what he had taken for spray was dust blowing from the empty basin. There was a thing about dusty fountains, some poem he'd read at the university. The fountains are dusty in the graveyard of dreams, the hinges are rusty, they swing with tiny screams. Was Poictesme a graveyard of dreams? No, junkyard of empire. The Terran Federation had impoverished 100 planets, devastated a score, actually depopulated at least 3, to keep the System States Alliance from seceding. It hadn't been a victory. It had only been a lesser defeat. There was a crowd, almost a mob, on the dock, nearly everybody in topside Litchfield. He spotted old Colonel Zaref, with his white hair and plum-brown skin, and Tom Brangwyn, the town marshal, red-faced and bulking above everybody else. Kurt Fawsey, the mayor, well to the front. Then he saw his father and mother, and his sister Flora, and waved to them. They waved back, and then everybody was waving. The gangway port opened, and the Academy band struck up, enthusiastically if inexpertly, as he descended to the dock. His father was wearing a black suit with a long coat, cut to the same pattern as the one he had worn 6 years ago. Blackout curtain cloth. It was fairly new, but the coat had begun to acquire a permanent wrinkle across the right hip, over the pistol butt. His mother's dress was new, and so was Flora's, made for the occasion. He couldn't be sure just which of the Federation Armed Forces had provided the material, but his father's shirt was Med-Service Sterilon. Ashamed to be noticing things like that, he clasped his father's hand, kissed his mother, embraced his sister. There were a few, but very few, grey threads in his father's mustache, a few more squint wrinkles around the eyes. His mother's hair was all grey, now, and she was heavier. She seemed shorter, but that would be because he'd grown a few inches in the last 6 years. For a moment, he was surprised that Flora actually looked younger. Then he realized that to 17, 23 is practically middle age, but to 23, 29 is almost contemporary. He noticed the glint on her left hand and caught it to look at the ring. "Hey! Zarathustra Sunstone." "Nice," he said. "Where is he, sis?" He'd never met her fiancé. Wade Lucas hadn't come to Litchfield to practice medicine until the year after he'd gone to Terra. "Oh, emergency," Flora said. "Obstetrical case, that won't wait on anything. In Tramptown, of course. But he'll be at the party." "Oops, I shouldn't have said that, that's supposed to be a surprise." "Don't worry, I'll be surprised," he promised. Then Kurt Fawsey was pushing forward, holding out his hand. Thinner and greyer, but just as effusive as ever. "Welcome home, Con Judge, shake hands with him and tell him how glad we all are to see him back. Now, Franz, put away the recorder, save the interview for the Chronicle till later. Ah, Professor Kelton, one pupil Litchfield Academy can be proud of." He shook hands with them, Judge Ledoux, Franz Veltrin, old Professor Dolph Kelton. They were all happy. How much, he wondered, because he was Conn Maxwell, Rodney Maxwell's son, home from Terra, and how much because of what they hoped he'd tell them. Kurt Fawsey, edging him aside, was the first to speak of it. "Con, what did you find out?" he whispered. "Do you know where it is?" He stammered, then saw Tom Brangwyn and Colonel Clem Zaref approaching, the older man tottering on a silver-headed cane and the younger keeping pace with him. Neither of them had been born on Poictesme. Tom Brangwyn had always been reticent about where he came from, but Uther was a good guess. There had been political trouble on Uther 20 years ago. The losers had had to get off-planet in a hurry to dodge firing squads. Clem Zaref never was reticent about his past. He came from Ashmedai, one of the System States planets, and he had commanded a regiment, and finally a division that had been blasted down to less than regimental strength, in the Alliance Army. He always wore a little rosette of System States black and green on his coat. "Hello, boy," he croaked, extending a hand. "Good to see you again." "It sure is, Conn," the town marshal agreed, then lowered his voice. "Find out anything definite?" "We didn't have much time, Conn," Kurt Forsey said, "but we've arranged a little celebration for you. We'll start it with a dinner at Center's." "You couldn't have done anything I'd have liked better, Mr. Forsey. I'd have to have a meal at Center's before I'd really feel at home." "Well, it'll be a couple of hours. Suppose we all go up to my office, in the meantime. Give the ladies a chance to fix up for the party, and have a little drink and a talk together." "You want to do that, Conn?" his father asked. There was an odd undernote of anxiety, or reluctance, in his voice. "Yes, of course. I'd like that." His father turned to speak to his mother and Flora. Kurt Forsey was speaking to his wife, interrupting himself to shout instructions to some laborers who were bringing up a contragravity skid. Conn turned to Colonel Zaref. "Good melon crop this year?" he asked. The old rebel cursed. "Gehenna of a big crop, we're up to our necks in melons. This time next year we'll be washing our feet in brandy." "Hold on to it and age it, you ought to see what they charge for a drink of Poictesme brandy on Terra." "This isn't Terra, and we aren't selling it by the drink," Colonel Zaref said. "We're selling it at Storisend Spaceport, for what the freighter captains pay us. You've been away too long, Conn. You've forgotten what it's like to live in a poorhouse." The cargo was coming off, now. Cask staves, and more cask staves. Zaref swore bitterly at the sight, and then they started toward the wide doors of the shipping floor, inside the airline's building. Outgoing cargo was beginning to come out, casks of brandy, of course, and a lot of boxes and crates, painted light blue and bearing the yellow trefoil of the 3rd Fleet Army Force and the 8-pointed red star of ordnance. Cases of rifles, square boxes of ammunition, crated autocannon. Conn turned to his father. "This our stuff?" he asked. "Where did you dig it?" Rodney Maxwell laughed. "You know the old 10th Army headquarters, over back of Snagtooth, in the Calders? Everybody knows that was cleaned out years ago. Well, always take a second look at these things everybody knows. 10 to 1 they're not so. It always bothered me that nobody found any underground attack shelters. I took a second look, and sure enough, I found them, right underneath, mined out of the solid rock. Conn, you'd be surprised at what I found there." "Where are you going to sell that stuff?" he asked, pointing at a passing skid. "There's enough combat equipment around now to outfit a private army for every man, woman, and child in Poictesme. Storisend Spaceport. The freighter captains buy it, and sell it on some of the planets that were colonized right before the war and haven't gotten industrialized yet. I'm clearing about 200 sols a ton on it." The skid at which he had pointed was loaded with cases of M50 for submachine guns. Even used, one was worth 50 sols. Allowing for packing weight, his father was selling those Tommy guns for less than a good cafe on Terra got for one drink of Poictesme brandy. Chapter 2. He had been in Kurt Forsey's office before, once or twice, with his father. He remembered it as a dim, quiet place of genteel conviviality and rambling conversation. None of the lights were bright, and the walls were almost invisible in the shadows. As they entered, Tom Brangwyn went to the long table and took off his belt and holster, laying it down. One by one, the others unbuckled their weapons and added them to the pile. Clem Zaref's cane went on the table with his pistol. There was a sword inside it. That was something else he was seeing with new eyes. He hadn't started carrying a gun when he had left for Terra, and he was wondering, now, why any of them bothered to. Why, there wouldn't be a shooting a year in Litchfield, if you didn't count the Tramptowners, and they stayed south of the docks and off the top level. Or perhaps that was just it. Lichfield was peaceful because everybody was prepared to keep it that way. It certainly wasn't because of anything the planetary government did to maintain order. Now Brangwyn was setting out glasses, filling a pitcher from a keg in the corner of the room. The last time Conn had been here, they'd given him a glass of wine, and he'd felt very grown up because they didn't water it for him. "Well, gentlemen," Kurt Forsey was saying, "let's have a toast to our returned friend and new associate. Conn, we're all anxious to hear what you've found out, but even if you didn't learn anything, we're still happy to have you back with us. Gentlemen, to our friend and neighbor. Welcome home, Conn." "Well, it's wonderful to be back, Mr. Forsey," he began. "Here, none of this Mr. Foolishness, you're one of us, now, Conn. And drink up, everybody. We have plenty of brandy, if we don't have anything else." "You can say that again, Kurt." That was one of the distillery people, he'd remember the name in a moment. "When this new crop gets pressed and fermented." "I don't know where in Gehenna I'm going to vat mine till it ferments," Clem Zaref said. "Or why," another planter added. "Lorenzo, what are you going to be paying for wine?" Lorenzo Menards, that was the name. The distiller said he was worrying about what he'd be able to get for brandy. "Oh, please," Forsey interrupted. "Not today, not when our boy's home and is going to tell us how we can solve all our problems." "Yes, Conn." That was Morgan Gatworth, the lawyer. "You did find out where Merlin is, didn't you?" That set them all off. He was still holding his drink, he downed it in one gulp, barely tasting it, and handed the glass to Tom Brangwyn for a refill, and caught a frown on his father's face. One did not gulp drinks in Kurt Forsey's office. Well, neither did one blast everybody's hopes with half a dozen words, and that was what he was trying to force himself to do. He wanted to blurt out the one quick sentence and get it over with, but the words wouldn't come out of his throat. He lowered the second drink by half. The brandy was beginning to warm him and dissolve the cold lump in his stomach. Have to go easy, though. He wasn't used to this kind of drinking, and he wanted to stay sober enough to talk sense until he'd told them what he had to. "I hope," he said, "that you don't expect me to show you the cross on the map, where the computer is buried." All the eyes around him began to look troubled. Most of them had been expecting precisely that. His father was watching him anxiously. "But it's still here on Poictesme, isn't it?" one of the melon planters asked. "They didn't take it away with them." "Most of you gentlemen," he said, "contributed to sending me to school on Terra, to study cybernetics and computer theory. It wouldn't do us any good to find Merlin if none of us could operate it. Well, I've done that. I can use any known type of computer, and train assistants. After I graduated, I was offered a junior instructorship to computer physics at the university." "You didn't mention that, son," his father said. "The letter would have come on the same ship I did. Besides, I didn't think it was very important." "I think it is." There was a catch in old Dolph Kelton's voice. "One of my boys from the academy offered a place on the faculty of the University of Montevideo, on Terra." He finished his drink and held out his glass for more, something he almost never did. "Conn means," Kurt Forsey explained, "that it had nothing to do with Merlin." "All right, now tell them the truth." "I was also to find out anything I could about a secret giant computer used during the war by the 3rd Fleet Army Force, codenamed Merlin. I went over all the records available to the public. I used your letter, Professor, and the head of our modern history department secured me access to non-public material, some of it still classified. For one thing, I have locations and maps and plans of every Federation installation built here between 842 and 854, the whole period of the war." He turned to his father. There are incredible things still undiscovered. Most of the important installations were built in duplicate, sometimes triplicate, as a precaution against space attack. I know where all of them are. Space attack? Clem Zaref was indignant. There never was a time we could have attacked Poictesme. Even if we'd had the ships, we were fighting a purely defensive war. Aggression was no part of our policy. He interrupted, "Excuse me, Colonel. The point I was trying to make is that, with all I was able to learn, I could find nothing, not one single word, about any giant strategic planning computer called Merlin, or any Merlin project." There. He'd gotten that out. Now go on and tell them about the old man in the dome house on Luna. The room was silent, except for the small insectile hum of the electric clock. Then somebody set a glass on the table, and it sounded like a hammer blow. "Nothing, Conn." Kurt Forsey was incredulous. Judge Ledoux's hand shook as though palsied as he tried to relight his cigar. Dolph Kelton was looking at the drink in his hand as though he had no idea what it was. The others found their voices, one by one. Of course, it was the most closely guarded secret. But after 40 years... "Ha, don't tell me about security." Colonel Zaref barked. "You should have seen the lengths our staff went to. I remember, once, on Mephistopheles. But there was a computer codenamed Merlin, Judge Ledoux was insisting, to convince himself more than anybody else. Its memory bank contained all human knowledge. It was capable of scanning all its data instantaneously, and combining, and forming associations, and reasoning with absolute accuracy, and extrapolating to produce new facts, and predicting future events, and if you'd asked such a computer, "Is there a God?" it would have simply answered, "Present." We'd have won the war, except for Merlin, Zaref was declaring. "Conn, from what you've learned of computers generally, how big would Merlin have to be?" old Professor Kelton asked. "Well, the astrophysics computer at the university occupied a volume of 100,000 cubic feet. For all Merlin was supposed to do, I'd say something of the order of 3 million to 5 million. Well, it's a cinch they didn't haul that away with them," Lester Dawes, the banker, said. "Oh, lots of places on Poictesme where they could have hid a thing like that," Tom Brangwen said. "You know, a planet's a mighty big place." "It doesn't have to be on Poictesme, even," Morgan Gatworth pointed out. "It could be anywhere in the Tri-System." "You know where I'd have put it?" Lorenzo Menards asked. "On one of the moons of Pantagruel." "But that's in the Gamma system, 3 light-years away," Kurt Forsey objected. "There isn't a hypership on this planet, and it would take half a lifetime to get there on normal space drive." Conn was lifting his glass to his lips. He set it down again and rose to his feet. "Then," he said, "we will build a hypership. On Koschei there are shipyards and hyperdrive engines and everything we will need. We only need one normal space interplanetary ship to get out there, and we're in business." "Well, I don't know we need one," Judge Ledoux said. "That was only an idea of Lorenzo's. I think Merlin's right here on Poictesme." "We don't know it is," Conn replied. "And we don't know we won't need a ship. Merlin may be on Koschei, that's where the components would be fabricated, and the armed forces weren't hauling anything any farther than they had to. Koschei's only 2.5 minutes away by radio, that's practically in the next room. Look, here's how they could have done it." He went on talking about remote controls and radio transmission and positronic brains and neutrino circuits. They believed it all, even the little they understood. They would believe anything he told them about Merlin except the truth. "But this will take money," Lester Dawes said. "And after that infernal deluge of unsecured paper currency 30 years ago. I have no doubt," Judge Ledoux began, "that the planetary government at Storisend would give assistance. I have some slight influence with President Wickhoven. Ha! That was one of Clem's RF's fellow planters. We don't want Jake Wickhoven or any of this first families of Storysend oligarchy in this at all. That's the gang that bankrupted the government with doles and work relief, and everybody else with worthless printing press money after the war, and they've been squatting in a circle deploring things ever since. Some of these days Blackie Paulus and his pirates will sack Storysend, for all they'd be able to do to stop him. We get a ship out to Koschei, and the next thing you know will be the planetary government, Tom Brangwyn said. Rodney Maxwell finished the brandy in his glass and set it on the table, then went to the pile of belts and holsters and began rummaging for his own. Kurt Forsey looked up in surprise. "Rod, you're not leaving, are you?" he asked. "Yes. It's only half an hour till time for dinner, and I think Conn and I ought to have a little fresh air. Besides, you know, we haven't seen each other for 6 years." He buckled on the heavy automatic and settled the belt over his hips. "You didn't have a gun, did you, Conn?" he asked. "Well, let's go." Chapter 3. It wasn't until they were down to the main level and outside in the little plaza to the east of the airlines building that his father broke the silence. "That was quite a talk you gave them, Conn." They believed every word of it. I even caught myself starting to believe it once or twice. Conn stopped short, his father halted beside him. "Why didn't you tell them the truth, son?" Rodney Maxwell asked. The question, which he had been throwing at himself, angered him. "Why didn't I just grab a couple of pistols and shoot the lot of them?" he retorted. "It wouldn't have killed them any deader, and it wouldn't have hurt as much." There is no Merlin. Is that it? He realized, suddenly, that his father had known, or suspected that all along. He started to say something, then checked himself and began again. "There never was one. I was going to tell them, but you saw them. I couldn't." "You're sure of it?" "The whole thing's a myth. I'm quoting the one man in the galaxy who ought to know. The man who commanded the Third Force here during the war. Fox Travis." His father's voice was soft with wonder. "I saw him once, when I was 8 years old. I thought he'd died long ago. Why, he must be over 100. 112. He's living on Luna, low gravity's all that keeps him alive." "And you talked to him?" "Yes." There'd been a girl in his third-year biophysics class. He'd found out that she was a great-granddaughter of Force General Travis. It had taken him until his senior midterm vacation to wangle an invitation to the Dome House on Luna. After that, it had been easy. As soon as Fox Travis had learned that one of his great-granddaughter's guests was from Poictesme, he had insisted on talking to him. "What did he tell you?" The old man had been incredibly thin and frail. Under normal gravitation, his life would have gone out like a blown match. Even at 1/6 G, it had cost him effort to rise and greet the guest. There had been a younger man, a mere stripling of 70-odd, he had been worried, and excused himself at once. Travis had laughed after he had gone out. "Mike Shanley, my aide-de-camp on Poictesme. Now he thinks he's my keeper. He'll have a squad of doctors and a platoon of nurses in here as soon as you're gone, so take your time. Now, tell me how things are on Poictesme." "Just about that," he told his father. "I finally mentioned Merlin, as an old legend people still talked about. I was ashamed to admit anybody really believed in it." He laughed, and said, "Great goo, is that thing still around?" "Well, I suppose so. It was all through the Third Force during the war. Lord only knows how these rumors start among troops. We never contradicted it, it was good for morale." They had started walking again, and were out on the mall. The sky was flaming red and orange from high cirrus clouds in the sunset light. They stopped by a dry fountain, perhaps the one from which he had seen the dust blowing. Rodney Maxwell sat down on the edge of the basin and got out 2 cigars, handing one to Conn, who produced his lighter. "Conn, they wouldn't have believed you and Fox Travis," he said. "Merlin's a religion with those people. Merlin's a robot god, something they can shove all their problems onto. As soon as they find Merlin, everybody will be rich and happy, the government bonds will be redeemed at face value plus interest, the paper money will be worth 100 Federation centisols to the soul, and the leaves and waste paper will be raked off them all by magic." He muttered an unprintability and laughed bitterly. "I didn't know you were the village atheist, Father." In a religious community, the village atheist keeps his doubts to himself. "I have to do business with these Merlinolators. It's all I can do to keep Flora from antagonizing them at school." Flora was a teacher, now she was assistant principal of the grade schools. Professor Kelton was also school superintendent. He could see how that would be. "Flora's not a true believer, then?" Rodney Maxwell shook his head. "That's largely Wade Lucas's influence, I'd say. You know about him?" "Just from letters. Wade Lucas was from Balder. He'd gone off-planet as soon as he'd gotten his MD. Evidently the professional situation there was the same as on Terra, plenty of opportunities, and 50 competitors for each one. On Poictesme, there were few opportunities, but nobody competed for anything, not even to find Merlin. He'd never heard of Merlin till he came here, and when he did, he just couldn't believe in it. I don't blame him. I've heard about it all my life, and I can't." "Why not?" "To begin with, I suppose, because it's just another of these things everybody believes. Then, I've had to do some studying on the third force occupation of Poictesme to know where to go and dig, and I never found any official, or even reliably unofficial, mention of anything of the sort. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret, you know. And I can't see why they didn't come back for it after the pressure to get the troops home was off, or why they didn't build a dozen Merlins. This isn't the only planet that has problems they can't solve for themselves." "What's Mother's attitude on Merlin?" "She's against it. She thinks it isn't right to make machines that are smarter than people." "I'll agree. It's scientifically impossible." "That's what I've been trying to tell her. Conn, I noticed that after Kurt Forsey started talking about how long it would take to get to the Gamma system, you jumped right into it and began talking up a ship. Did you think that if you got them started on that it would take their minds off Merlin? That gang up in Forsey's office? Niflheim, no. They'll go on hunting Merlin till they die. But I was serious about the ship. An idea hit me. You gave it to me, you and Clem's RF. Why, I didn't say a word. Down on the shipping floor, before we went up. You were talking about selling arms and ammunition at a profit of 200 sols a ton, and Clem was talking as though a bumper crop was worse than a green death epidemic. If we had a hypership, look what we could do. How much do you think a settler on Hoth or Mailbolge or Iminsel would pay for a good rifle and 1,000 rounds? How much would he pay for his life? That's what it would come to. And do you know what a 15cc liqueur glass of Poictesme brandy sells for on Terra? 1 sol, Federation money. I'll admit it costs like Niflheim to run a hypership, but look at the difference between what these tramp freighter captains pay at Storisend and what they get. I've been looking at it for a long time. Maybe if we had a few ships of our own, these planters would be breaking new ground instead of cutting their plantings, and maybe we'd get some money on this planet that was worth something. You have a good idea there, son. But maybe there's an angle to it you haven't thought of." Conn puffed slowly at the cigar. Why couldn't they grow tobacco like this on Terra? Soil chemicals, he supposed, that wasn't his subject. You can't put this scheme over on its own merits. This gang wouldn't lift a finger to build a hypership. They've completely lost hope in everything but Merlin. Well, can do. I'll even convince them that Merlin's a space station, in orbit off Koschei. I think I could do that. You know what it'll cost? If you go ahead with it, I'm in it with you, make no mistake about that. But you and I will be the only two people on Poictesme who can be trusted with the truth. We'll have to lie to everybody else, with every word we speak. We'll have to lie to Flora, and we'll have to lie to your mother. Your mother most of all. She believes in absolutes. Lying is absolutely wrong, no matter whom it helps. Telling the truth is absolutely right, no matter how much damage it does or how many hearts it breaks. You think this is going to be worth a price like that? Don't you? He demanded, and then pointed along the crumbling and littered mall. Look at that. Pretend you never saw it before and are looking at it for the first time. And then tell me whether it'll be worth it or not. His father took a cigar from his mouth. For a moment, he sat staring silently. Great goo. Rodney Maxwell turned. I wonder how that sneaked up on me, I honestly never realized. Yes, Conn. This is a cause worth lying for. He looked at his watch. We ought to be starting for centers, but let's take a few minutes and talk this over. How are you going to get it started? Well, convince them that I can find Merlin and that they can't find it without me. I think I've done that already. Then convince them that we'll have to have a ship to get to Poictesme, and won't do. That'll take money, and money's something none of this gang has. You heard me talk about the stuff I found out on Terra. Father, you have no idea what all there is. You remember the old Force Command headquarters, the one the planetary government took over? I know where there's a duplicate of that, completely underground. It has everything the other one had, and a lot more, because it'll be crammed full of supplies to be used in case of a general blitz that would knock out everything on the planet. And a chain of hospitals. And a spaceport, over on Barathrum, that was built inside the crater of an extinct volcano. There won't be any hyperships there of course, but there'll be equipment and material. We might be able to build a ship there. And supply depots, all over the planet, none of them has ever been opened since the war. Don't worry about financing, we have that. His father, he could see, appreciated what he had brought home from Terra. He was nodding, with quick head jerks, at each item. That'll do it, all right. Now, listen, what we want to do is get a company organized, a regular limited liability company, with a charter. We'll contribute the information you brought back from Terra, and we'll get the rest of this gang to put all the money we can twist out of them into it, so we'll be sure they won't say, AW, Niflheim with it, and walk out on us as soon as the going gets a little tough. Rodney Maxwell got to his feet, hitching his gun belt. I'll pass the word to Kurt to get a meeting set up for tomorrow afternoon. What'll we call this company? Merlin Rediscovery, Limited. No. We keep Merlin out of it. As far as the public is supposed to know, this is just a war material prospecting company. I'll impress on them that Merlin is to be kept a secret. That way, we'll have to engage in regular prospecting and salvage work as a front. I'll see to it that the front is also the main objective. He nodded down the mall, toward the sunset, which was blazing even higher and redder. Well, let's go. You don't want to be late for your own welcome home party. They walked slowly, still talking, until they came to the end of the mall. The escalators to the level below weren't working. Now that he thought of it, they hadn't been when he had gone away, 6 years ago, but he could remember riding up and down on them as a small child. For a moment they stood in the sunset light, looking down on the lower terrace as they finished their cigars. Centers was mostly outdoors, the tables under the open sky. The people gathered below were looking at the sunset, too. Litchfielders loved to watch sunsets, maybe because a sunset was one of the few things economic conditions couldn't affect. There was Kurt Forsey, the center of a group to whom he was declaiming earnestly. There was his mother, and Flora's fiancé, who was the uncomfortable lone man in an excited feminine flock. And there was Center herself, short and dumpy, in one of her preposterous red and purple dresses, bubbling happily one moment and screaming invective at some laggard waiter the next. They threw away their cigars and started down the long, motionless escalator. Conn Maxwell, hero of the hour, marching to destiny. He seemed to hear trumpets sounding before him, and an occasional muted Bronx cheer. Chapter 4. The alarm chimed softly beside his bed. He reached out and silenced it, and lay looking at the early sunlight in the windows, and found that he was wishing himself back in his dorm room at the university. No, back in this room, 10 years ago, before any of this had started. For a while, he imagined himself 13 years old and knowing everything he knew now, and he began mapping a campaign to establish himself as Litchfield's juvenile delinquent number 1, to the end that Kurt Forsey and Dolph Kelton and the rest of them would never dream of sending him to school on terror to find out where Merlin was. But he couldn't even go back to yesterday afternoon in Kurt Forsey's office and tell them the truth. All he could do was go ahead. It had seemed so easy, when he and his father had been talking on the mall, just get a ship built, and get out to Poictesme, and open some of the shipyards and engine works there, and build a hypership. Sure, easy once he got started. He climbed out of bed, knuckled the sleep sand out of his eyes, threw his robe around him, and started across the room to the bath cubicle. They had decided to have breakfast together his first morning home. The party had broken up late, and then there had been the excitement of opening the presents he had brought back from Terra. Nobody had had a chance to talk about Merlin, or about what he was going to do, now that he was home. That, and his career of mendacity, would start at breakfast. He wanted to let his father get to the table first, to run interference for him. He took his time with his toilet and dressed carefully and slowly. Finally, he zipped up the short waist-length jacket and went out. His father and mother and Flora were at the table, and the serving robot was floating around a few inches off the floor, steam trailing from its coffee urn and its tray lid up to offer food. He greeted everybody and sat down at his place, and the robot came around to him. His mother had selected all the things he'd been most fond of 6 years ago: shovel-snout bacon, hotcakes, starberry jam, things he hadn't tasted since he had gone away. He filled his plate and poured a cup of coffee. "You don't want to bother coming out to the dig with me this morning, do you?" his father was saying. "I'll be back here for lunch, and we'll go to the meeting in the afternoon." "Meeting?" Flora asked. "What meeting?" "Oh, we didn't have time to tell you," Rodney Maxwell said. "You know, Conn brought back a lot of information on locations of supply depots and things like that. An amazing list of things that haven't been discovered yet. It's going to be too much for us to handle alone. We're organizing a company to do it. We'll need a lot of labor, for one thing, jobs for some of these tramptowners." "That's going to be something awfully big," his mother said dubiously. "You never did anything like that before." "I never had the kind of a partner I have now. It's Maxwell and Son, from now on." "Who's going to be in this company?" Flora wanted to know. "Oh, everybody around town, Kurt and the Judge and Clem, and Lester Dawes. All that crowd." "The Forsey's office gang," Flora said disparagingly. "I suppose they'll want Conn to take them right to where Merlin is, the first thing." "Well, not the first thing," Conn said. "Merlin was one thing I couldn't find out anything about on Terra." "I'll bet you couldn't." "The people at Armed Forces Records would let me look at everything else, and make microcopies and all, but not one word about computers. 40 years, and they still have the security lid welded shut on that." Flora looked at him in shocked surprise. "You don't mean to tell me you believe in that thing?" "Sure. How do you think they fought a war around a perimeter of close to 1,000 light-years? They couldn't do all that out of their heads. They'd have to have computers, and the one they'd use to correlate everything and work out grand strategy plans would have to be a dilly. Why, I'd give anything just to look at the operating panels for that thing." But that's just a silly story, there never was anything like Merlin. No wonder you couldn't find out about it. You were looking for something that doesn't exist, just like all these old cranks that sit around drinking brandy and mooning about what Merlin's going to do for them, and never doing anything for themselves. Oh, they're going to do something, now, Flora, his father told her. When we get this company organized, you'll dig up a lot of stuff you won't be able to sell, like that stuff you've been bringing in from 10th Army, and then you'll go looping off chasing Merlin, like the rest of them. Well, maybe that'll be a little better than just sitting in Kurt Forz's office talking about it, but not much. It kept on like that. Conn and his father tried several times to change the subject, each time Flora ignored the effort and returned to her diatribe. Finally, she put her plate and cup on the robot's tray and got to her feet. I have to go, she said. Maybe I can do something to keep some of these children from growing up to be Merlin worshippers like their parents. She flung out of the room angrily. Mrs. Maxwell looked after her in distress. And I thought it was going to be so nice, having breakfast together again, she lamented. Somehow the breakfast wasn't quite as good as he'd thought it was at first. He wondered how many more breakfasts like that he was going to have to sit through. He and his father finished quickly and got up, while his mother started the robot to clearing the table. Conn, she said, after his father had gone out, you shouldn't have gotten Flora started like that. I didn't get Flora started, she's equipped with a self-starter. If she doesn't believe in Merlin, that's her business. A lot of these people do, and I'm going to help them hunt for it. That's why they all chipped in to send me to school on Terra, remember? Yes, I know. Her voice was heavy with distress. Conn, do you really believe there is that thing, she asked. Why, of course. He was mildly surprised at how sincerely and straightforwardly he said it. I don't know where it is, but it's somewhere on Poictesme, or in the Alpha system. Well, do you think it would be a good thing to find it? That surprised him. Everybody knew it would be, and his mother didn't share his father's attitude about things everybody knew. She hadn't any business questioning a fundamental postulate like that. It frightens me, she continued. I don't even like to think about it. A soulless intelligence, it seems evil to me. Well, of course it's soulless. It's a machine, isn't it? An aircar's soulless, but you're not afraid to ride in one. But this is different. A machine that can think. Conn, people weren't meant to make machines like that, wiser than they are. Now wait a minute, Mother. You're talking to a computer man now. Professional authority was something his mother oughtn't to question. A computer like Merlin isn't intelligent, or wise, or anything of the sort. It doesn't think, the people who make computers and use them do the thinking. A computer's a tool, like a screwdriver, it has to have a man to use it. Well, but... And please, don't talk about what people are meant to do. People aren't meant to do things, they mean to do things, and 9 times out of 10, they end by doing them. It may take 100,000 years from a Stone Age savage in a cave to the captain of a hyperspace ship, but sooner or later they get there. His mother was silent. The soulless machine that had been clearing the table floated out of the room, the dishwasher in its rectangular belly gurgling. Maybe what he had told her was logical, but women aren't impressed by logic. She knew better for the good old feminine reason, because Wade Lucas wanted me to drop in on him for a checkup, he mentioned. That's rubbish, I had one for my landing pratique on the ship. He just wants to size up his future brother-in-law. Well, you ought to go see him. How did Flora come to meet him, anyhow? Well, you know, he came from Balder. He was in Storisend, looking for an opening to start a practice, and he heard about some medical equipment your father had found somewhere and came out to see if he could buy it. Your father and Judge Ledoux and Mr. Fawsey talked him into opening his office here. Then he and Flora got acquainted. She asked, anxiously, "What did you think of him, Conn?" "Seems like a regular guy. I think I'll like him. A husband like Wade Lucas might be a good thing for Flora. I'll drop in on him sometime this morning." His mother went toward the rear of the house, more soulless machines, like the house-cleaning robot and the laundry robot, to look after. He went into his father's office and found the cigar humidor, just where it had been when he'd stolen cigars out of it 6 years ago and thought his father never suspected what he was doing. Now, why didn't they export this tobacco? It was better than anything they grew on Terra. Well, at least it was different, just as Poictesme brandy was different from Terran bourbon or Balder honey rum. That was the sort of thing that could be sold in interstellar trade anytime and anywhere, the luxury goods that were unique. Staple foodstuffs, utility textiles, metal products, could be produced anywhere, and sooner or later they were. That was the reason for the original, pre-war depression. The customers were all producing for themselves. He'd talked that over with his father. He wished he'd had time to take some economics at the university. He found the file his father kept up to date on salvage sites found and registered with the claims office in Storysend. Some of the locations he had brought back data for had been discovered, but, to his relief, not the underground duplicate force command headquarters, and not the spaceport on the island continent of Barathrum, to the east. That was all right. He went to the house defense arms closet and found a 10mm Navy pistol, and a belt and spare clips. Making sure that the pistol and magazines were loaded, he buckled it on. He debated getting a vehicle out of the hangar on the landing stage, decided against it, and started downtown on foot. One of the first people he met was Len Yeniguchi, the tailor. He would be at the meeting that afternoon. He managed, while talking, to comment on the cut of Conn's suit, and finger the material. "Ah, nice," he complimented. "Made on Terra? We don't see cloth like that here very often." He meant it wasn't armed forces salvage. "Father ought to be around to see you with a bolt of material, to have a suit made," he said. "For goose sake, either talk him into having a short jacket like this, or get him to buy himself a shoulder holster. He's ruined every coat he ever owned, carrying a gun on his hip." A little farther on, he came to a combat car grounded in the middle of the street. It was green, with black trimmings, and lettered in black, "Gordon Valley Home Guard." Tom Brangwyn was standing beside it, talking to a young man in a green uniform. "Hello, Conn." The town marshal looked at his hip and grinned. "See, you got all your clothes on this morning. You were just plain indecent yesterday. You know Fred Karski, don't you?" Yes, now that Tom mentioned it, he did. He and Fred had gone to school together at the Litchfield Academy. But the 6 years since they'd seen each other last had made a lot of difference in both of them. He was beginning to think that the only strangers in Litchfield were his own contemporaries. They shook hands, and Conn looked at the combat car and Fred Karski's uniform. "What's going on?" he asked. "The System States Alliance to business again." Karski laughed. "Oh, that's the Colonel's idea. Green and black were his colors in the war, and he's in command of the regiment." "Regiment? You need a whole regiment?" Conn asked. "Well, it's 2 companies, each about the size of a regular army platoon, but we have to call it a regiment so he can keep his old rebel army rank." "We could use a regiment, Conn," Tom Brangwyn said seriously. "You have no idea how bad things have gotten. Over on the East Coast, the outlaws are looting whole towns. About 4 months ago, they sacked Waterville, burned the whole town and killed close to 100 people. That was Blackie Paulus' gang." "Who is this Blackie Paulus?" "I heard the name mentioned in connection with the Harriet Bairn." "Blackie Paulus is anybody the planetary government can't catch, which means practically any outlaw," Fred Karski said. No, Fred, there is a Blackie Paulus, Tom Brangwyn said. He used to be a planter, down in the south. The banks foreclosed on him when he couldn't pay his notes, and he turned outlaw. That's the way it's going, all around. Every time a planter loses his plantation or a farmer loses his farm, or a mechanic loses his job, he turns outlaw. Take Tramptown, here. We used to plant nothing but melons. Then, when the sale for wine and brandy dropped, the melon planters began cutting their melon crops and raising produce, instead of buying it from up north, and turning land into pasture for cattle. The people we used to buy foodstuffs from couldn't sell all they raised, and that threw a lot of farmhands out of work. So they got the idea there was work here, and they came flocking in, and when they couldn't get jobs, they just stayed in Tramptown, stealing anything they could. We don't even try to police Tramptown anymore, we just see to it they don't come up here. Well, where do these outlaws and pirates who are looting whole towns come from? Down in the Badlands, mostly. None of them have been bothering us since we organized the Home Guard. They tried to, a couple of times, at first. There may have been a few survivors. They spread it around that Gordon Valley wasn't any outlaws' health resort. Why don't you join us, Conn? Fred Karski asked. All our old gang belong. I'd like to, but I'm afraid I'm going to be kind of busy. Brangwyn nodded. Yes. You will be, at that, he agreed. So I hear, Fred Karski said. Do you really know where it is, Conn? Well, no. He went into the routine about Merlin being still classified triple top secret. But we'll find it. It may take time, but we will. They talked for a while. He asked more questions about the Home Guard. His father, it seemed, had donated all the equipment. They had 170 men on the active list, but they had a reserve of over 800, and combat vehicles and weapons on all the plantations and in all the towns along the river. The reserve had only been turned out twice. Both times, outlaw attacks had been stopped dead literally. The Home Guard, it appeared, was not given to making arrests or taking prisoners. Finally, he parted from them, strolling on along the row of stores and business places, many vacant, under the south edge of the mall, until he saw a fluorolight sign, Wade Lucas, M.D. He entered. Lucas wasn't busy. They went into his consultation office, and Conn took off his gun belt and hung it up. Lucas offered cigarettes, and they lighted and sat down. I see you've started carrying one, he said, nodding to the pistol Conn had laid aside. Civic obligation. I'm going to be too busy for Home Guard duty, but if I can protect myself, it'll save somebody else the job of protecting me. Maybe if there weren't so many guns around, there wouldn't be so much trouble. He felt his good opinion of Wade Lucas start to slip. The liberals on terror had been full of that kind of talk, which was why only 4 out of 10 of last year's graduating class at Armed Forces Academy had been able to get active commissions. The last war had been a disaster, so don't prepare for another one. When it comes, let it be a worse disaster. Guns don't make trouble, people make trouble. If the troublemakers are armed, you have to be armed too. When did you last see an air patrol boat around here, or even a constabulary trooper? All we have here is the Home Guard and Tom Brangwyn and 3 deputies, and his pay and theirs is always 6 months in arrears. Lucas nodded. A bankrupt government, an unemployment rate that rises every year, currency that buys less every month. And do-it-yourself justice. The doctor blew a smoke ring and watched it float toward the ventilator intake. You said you're going to be busy. This company your father's talking about organizing. That's right. You're going to be at the meeting at the academy this afternoon, aren't you? Yes. Just what are you going to do after you get it organized? Well, I brought back information on a great deal of undiscovered equipment and stores that the Third Force left behind. He talked on for some time, keeping to safe generalities. It's too big for my father and me to handle alone, even if we didn't feel morally obligated to take in the people who contributed towards sending me to school on terror. You ought to be interested in it. I know of 6 fully supplied hospitals, intended to take care of the casualties in case of a system-state space attack. You can imagine, better than I can, what would be in them. Yes. Medical supplies of all sorts are getting hard to find. But look here, you're not going to let these people waste time looking for this alleged computer, this thing they call Merlin, are you? We're looking for any valuable war material. I don't know the location of Merlin, but I'll bet you don't. Lucas said vehemently. That was the same thing Flora had said. But Merlin is undoubtedly the most valuable item of abandoned TF equipment on this planet. In the long run, I'd say, more valuable than everything else together. We certainly aren't going to ignore it. Good heavens, Conn. You aren't like these people here, you were educated at the University of Montevideo. So I was. I studied computer theory and practice. I have some doubts about Merlin being able to do some of the things these laymen like Kelton and Fawsey and Judge Ledoux think it could. Those sorts of misconceptions and exaggerations have to be allowed for. But I have no doubt whatever that the master computer with which they did their strategic planning is probably the greatest mechanism of its sort ever built, and I have no doubt whatever that it still exists somewhere in the Alpha system. He almost convinced himself of it. He did not, however, convince Wade Lucas, who was now regarding him with narrow-eyed suspicion. You mean you categorically state that that computer actually exists? That, I think, was the general idea. Yes. I certainly do believe that Merlin exists. Maybe he was telling the truth. Merlin existed in the beliefs and hopes of people like Dolph Kelton and Clem Zaref and Judge Ledoux and Kurt Fawsey. Merlin was a god to them. Well, take Gu, the Thoran grandfather god. Gu was as preposterous, theologically, as Merlin was technologically. Gu, except to Thorans, was a Federation-wide joke. But he'd known a couple of Thorans at the university, funny little fellows, with faces like terriers, their bodies covered with matted black hair. They believed in Gu the way he believed in the second law of thermodynamics. Gu was with them every moment of their lives. Take away their belief in Gu, and they would have been lost and wretched. As lost and wretched as Kurt Fawsey or Judge Ledoux, if they lost their belief in Merlin. He started to say something like that, and then thought better of it. Yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. Chapter 5. The meeting was at the academy. When Conn and his father arrived, they found the central hall under the topside landing stage crowded. Kurt Fawsey and Professor Kelton had constituted themselves a reception committee. Franz Veltrin was in evidence with his audiovisual recorder, and Colonel Zaref was leaning on his silver-headed sword cane. Tom Brangwyn, in an unaccustomed best suit. Wade Lucas, among a group of merchants, arguing heatedly. Lorenzo Menards, the distiller, and Lester Dawes, the banker, and Morgan Gatworth, the lawyer, talking to Judge Ledoux. About 4 times as many as had been in Fawsey's office the afternoon before. Finally, everybody was shepherded into a faculty conference room. There was a long table, and a shorter one TYs at one end. Fawsey and Kelton conducted them to this. Both of them were trying to preside, Kelton because it was his academy, and Fawsey ex officio as mayor and professional leading citizen, and because he had come to regard Merlin as his own private project. After everybody else was seated, the 2 rival chairmen presumptive remained on their feet. Fawsey was saying, "Let's come to order, we must conduct this meeting regularly," and Kelton was saying, "Gentlemen, please, let me have your attention." If either of them took the chair, the other would resent it. Conn got to his feet again. "Somebody will have to preside," he said, loudly enough to cut through the babble at the long table. "Would you take the chair, Judge Ledoux?" That stopped it. Neither of them wanted to contest the honor with the president judge of the Gordon Valley Court. Excellent suggestion, Conn Judge, will you preside? Professor Kelton, who had seen himself losing out to Fawsey, asked. Fawsey threw one quick look around, estimated the situation, and got with it. Of course, Judge. You're the logical chairman. Here, will you sit here? Judge Ledoux took the chair, looked around for something to use as a gavel, and rapped sharply with a paperweight. Young Mr. Conn Maxwell, who has just returned from terror, needs no introduction to any of you, he began. Then, having established that, he took the next 10 minutes to introduce Conn. When people began fidgeting, he wound up with, now, only about a dozen of us were at the informal meeting in Mr. Fawsey's office, yesterday. Conn, would you please repeat what you told us? Elaborate as you see fit. Conn rose. He talked briefly about his studies on terror to qualify himself as an expert. Then he began describing the wealth of abandoned and still undiscovered Federation war material and the many installations of which he had learned, careful to avoid giving clues to exact locations. The spaceport, the underground duplicate force command headquarters, the vast underground arsenals and shops and supply depots. Everybody was awed, even his father. He hadn't had time to tell him more than a fraction of it. Finally, somebody from the long table interrupted. Well, Conn, how about Merlin? That's what we're interested in. Wade Lucas snorted indignantly. He's telling you about real things, things worth millions of souls, and you want him to talk about that idiotic fantasy. There was an angry outcry. Nobody actually shouted to the stake with the blasphemer, but that was the general idea. Judge Ledoux was rapping loudly for order. I don't know the exact location of Merlin. Conn strove to make himself heard. The whole subject's classified top secret. But I am certain that Merlin exists, if not on Poictesme then somewhere in the Alpha system, and I am equally certain that we can find it. Cheers. He waited for the hubbub to subside. Lucas was trying to yell above it. You admit you couldn't learn anything about this so-called Merlin, but you're still certain it exists. Why are you certain it doesn't? Why, the whole thing's absurdly fantastic. Maybe it is, to a layman like you. I studied computers, and it isn't to me. Well, take all these elaborate preparations against space attack you were telling us about. I think Colonel Zaref, here, who served in the Alliance Army, will bear me out that such an attack was plainly impossible. Zaref started to agree, then realized that he was aiding and comforting the enemy. Intelligence lag, he said. What do you expect, with General Headquarters 30 parsecs from the fighting? Yes. A computer can only process the data that's been taped into it, Conn said. That was a point he wanted to ram home, as forcibly and as often as possible. I suppose Merlin classified an alliance attack on Poictesme as a low-order probability, but war is the province of chance, Clausewitz said that 1,000 years ago. Fox Travis wasn't the sort of commander to let himself get caught, even by a very low-order probability. Well, how do you explain the absence, after 40 years, of any mention, in any history of the war, of Merlin? How do you get around that? I don't have to. How do you get around it? Huh? Lucas was startled. Yes. Stories about Merlin were all over Poictesme, all through the Third Force, even to the enemy. Say the stories were unfounded, say Merlin never existed. Yet the belief in Merlin was an important historical fact, and no history of the war gives it so much as a footnote. He paused for effect, then continued, that can mean only one thing. Systematic suppression, backed by the whole force of the Terran Federation. A gigantic conspiracy of silence. Brother. If they swallow that, I have it made, they'll swallow anything. They did, all but Lucas. He banged his fist on the table. Now I've heard everything, he shouted in disgust. Not quite everything, Dr. Morgan Gatworth said. You will hear, one of these days, that we have found Merlin. Yes, that'll be the day. Lucas sprang to his feet, his chair toppling behind him. He shoved it aside with his foot. I'm not going to argue with you. Conn Maxwell gave you a 1,000-year-old quotation. I'll give you another, from Thomas Paine. To argue with those who have renounced the use and authority of reason is as futile as to administer medicine to the dead. I'll add this. Conn Maxwell knows better than this balderdash he's been spouting to you. I don't know what his racket is, and I'm not staying to find out. You will, though, to your regret. He turned and strode from the room. There was a moment's silence, after the door slammed behind him. Too bad, Conn thought. He would have made a good friend. Now he was going to make a very nasty enemy. Well, let's get to business, his father said. We don't have to argue about the existence of Merlin, we know that. Let's discuss the question of finding it. I still think it's somewhere off-planet, Lorenzo Menord said. The moons of Pantagruel. Evidently he'd read something, or seen an old film, about the moons of Pantagruel. No, that's too far, they'd keep it where they could use it. The old GHQ, Lester Dawes suggested. Suppose it's down under that, like the place Rodney found under 10th Army. I hope not, Gatworth said. The planetary government took that over. Well, wherever it is, finding it is going to be expensive, Rodney Maxwell said. Now, to finance the search, I propose we use this information my son brought back from Terra. Dr. Lucas was right about one thing, that's worth millions of souls. Well, I propose, also, that we set up a company and get it chartered, a prospecting company, to operate under the Abandoned Property Act of 867. My son and I will contribute this information as our share in the capitalization of the company. The work of opening these Federation installations can go on concurrently with the search for Merlin, and the profits can finance it. Silence for a moment, then a bedlam of cheering. Well, let's get organized, Gatworth said. What will we call this company? A number of voices shouted suggestions. Rodney Maxwell managed to get recognition and partial silence. It is of the first importance, he said, that we keep our real objective, Merlin, as close a secret as possible. The planetary government would like to get hold of it, and I leave you to ask yourselves how far Jake Vickhoven and his cronies are to be trusted with anything like that, and I have no doubt the Federation might try to take it away from us. Couldn't do it, Rodney, Judge Ledoux objected. Everything the Federation abandoned in the Tri-System is public domain now. We have a Federation Supreme Court ruling. What's legality to the Federation? Clem Zaref demanded. They fought a criminally illegal war of aggression against my people. Down the table, somebody started singing Rally Round the banner black and green. Well, I think it's a good idea to keep quiet about it, myself, Kurt Forsey said. All right, Rodney Maxwell said. Then we don't want this company to sound like anything but another salvage company. I suggest we call it Litchfield Exploration and Salvage. Good name, Rodney, Dawes approved. That a motion? I second it. Unanimously carried. They had a name, now, anyhow. Everybody began suggesting other topics for consideration: capitalization, application for charter, election of officers, stock issues. Conn paid less and less attention. Industrial finance and organization wasn't his subject, either. His father was plunging happily into it as though he had been promoting companies all his life. Conn sat and doodled with his 6-color pen, mostly spherical hyperspaceships. We can't get all this cleared up now, Lester Dawes was protesting. Your Honor, I mean, Mr. Chairman, I suggest that committees be appointed. More hassling, everybody wanted to be on all the committees. Finally, they appointed enough committees to include everybody. Well, that seems to be cleared up, Judge Ledoux said. I suggest a meeting day after tomorrow evening. The committees should have everything set up, and we should be able to organize ourselves and elect permanent officers. Is there anything else to discuss, or do I hear a motion to adjourn? Somebody thought they ought to have some idea of what the first operation would be. You heard me mention a spaceport, Conn said. I can tell you, now, that it's over on Barathrum, inside the crater of an extinct volcano. I think we ought to have a look at that, first of all. I know you seemed to think yesterday that Merlin is off-planet, Fawzi said. I'm inclined to disagree, Conn. I think it's right here on Poictesme. We ought to nail that spaceport down first, Conn argued. Conn, you mentioned an underground duplicate of Travis's general headquarters, Zaref said. They thought we'd possibly send a fleet here to blitz Poictesme, or they wouldn't have built that. And this underground headquarters would be the safest place on the planet, they'd make sure of that. Staff brass don't like to get caught out in the rain, not when it's raining hellburners and planet busters. Merlin would be too big to take there along with them, so they'd put it there in the first place. That made sense. If he'd been Fox Travis, and if there had been a Merlin, that was exactly where he'd have put it himself. But there was no Merlin, and he wanted a ship. He argued mulishly for a little, then saw that it was hopeless and gave in. I want to find Merlin as much as any of you, he said. More. Merlin was the only thing I was trained for. We'll look there first. Somebody asked where, approximately, this underground force command headquarters was. Why, it's in the Badlands, over between the Blaubergs and the East Coast. Great goo. We'll need an army to go in there. Tom Brangwyn said. That's where all these outlaws have been coming from, Blackie Paulus and all. Then we'll get an army together, Clem Zaref said happily. Might make a little of that reward money that's been offered. We'll need more than that. We'll need excavation equipment, and labor. Lots of labor, Conn said. It's a couple of 100 feet below the surface, from the plans. I'd say they just dug a big pit, built the headquarters in it, and filled it in. There are 2 entrances, a vertical shaft and a horizontal tunnel. When they pulled out, they probably filled the shaft and vitrified the rock at the outer ends, his father added. That was what they did at 10th Army. Another idea hit him. Mr. Mayor, do you think you could set up some kind of a public works program here in Litchfield? We can't start this till after the wine pressing's over, and we'll need a lot of labor, as I pointed out. Now, it's important that we keep all our projects a secret until we can get our claims filed. If we start this municipal fix-up and clean-up program, we can give work to a lot of these drifters who haven't been able to get jobs on the plantations, get them organized into gangs, and keep them together till we're ready for the force command job. Lorenzo Menard supported the idea. And while they were boondoggling around in Litchfield, we could pick out the best workers, get rid of the incompetents, and train a few supervisors. That's going to be one of our worst headaches, getting capable supervisors. You telling me? Rodney Maxwell asked. That was what I was wondering about, where we'd get gang bosses. And another thing, this municipal house cleaning would mask our real preparations. Well, we need something like that, Fawzi said. We've needed it for a long time. I guess it took Conn, coming home from Terra, to see how badly we've let the town get run down. Franz, suppose you and Tom Brangwyn and Lorenzo form a committee on that. Look around, see what needs fixing up worst, and set up a project. Who's city engineer now? Abe O'Leary, he died 6 years ago, Dawes said. You never appointed his successor. Well, I guess I never got around to that, the mayor of Litchfield admitted. When the meeting finally adjourned, they went up and got in the car. His father lifted it straight up to 30,000 feet and started circling. An aircar was one place where they could talk safely. Conn, I was kind of worried, down there. You were being a little too positive. You know, you're only 23. As long as you agree with those people, you're a brilliant young man, you start getting ideas of your own, and you're just a half-baked kid. You let the older and wiser heads run things. You can't begin to hope to foul things up the way they can. Look at all the experience they've had. But we've got to have a ship. Everything depends on that. I know it does. We'll get a ship. Let Kurt Forsey and Clem Zaref and the rest of them have this duplicate force command thing first, though. Keep them happy. As soon as we have that opened, you can take a gang and run over to Barathrum and grab your spaceport. Wait till they find out that Merlin isn't at force command duplicate. Then you can convince them it's really on Poictesme. Chapter 6. The car Rodney Maxwell got out of the hangar the next morning wasn't the one he and Conn had gone to the meeting in, it was the one he had flown in from 10th Army HQ at noon of the previous day. An army reconnaissance job, slim and needle-like, completely enclosed, looking more like a missile than a vehicle, and armored in dazzling, iridescent collapsium. There was something to living on Poictesme, at that, only a millionaire on Terra could have owned a car like that. Nice, Conn said. Where did you dig it? Where we're going, 10th Army. I'll bet she'll do Mach 3. Better than that. I've never had her above 2.5, but the airspeed gauge is marked up to 4. And she has everything, all kinds of detection instruments, cameras, audiovisual pickups, armament. And the armor, you can take her through any kind of radiation. The armor was only a couple of micromicrons thick, but it would stop anything. It was collapsed matter, the electron shells of the atoms collapsed upon the nuclei, the atoms in actual contact. That plating made 8th-inch sheet steel as heavy as 12-inch armor plate, and in texture and shielding properties, lead was like sponge by comparison. They climbed in, and Rodney Maxwell snapped on the screens that served as windows. Conn leaned back and looked at the underside view in a screen on the roof of the car, as his father started the lift engine. Still think it's worth the price, son? His father asked. The price had begun to rise, even so, he was afraid that what they had paid so far was only the down payment. Dinner last evening. Flora, who had evidently been talking to Wade Lucas, shouting accusations at them, his mother fleeing from the table in tears. As the car rose, he reached out and turned on and adjusted the telescreen for the underview. Keep your eye on that, father, he said. That's what we're paying to get rid of. A distillery, bigger than the Menards plant, long closed and now half roofless and crumbling. Rows of warehouses, empty after the war until taken over by homeless vagrants. Jerry-built shanties with rattletrap aircars grounded around them. Tramptown, a festering sore on the south side of Litchfield. If we put this over, he continued, all those tramps will have steady work and good homes. We can have a park there, with fountains that'll work. Maybe even Flora and Mother will think we've done something worth doing. It'll be kind of hard to take in the meantime, though, but if you can take it, I can. Rodney Maxwell turned off the underside teleview screen and put on the forward one. See that little pink spot over there? Sunrise on the east side of Snagtooth, 10th Army's just behind us. Now, let's see if this airspeed gauge is telling the truth or just bragging. Sudden acceleration pushed them back in their seats. The calibrations on the gauge rose swiftly, the pink lighted peak grew swiftly in the teleview screen. The gauge hadn't been bragging, it had been understating, the car had more speed than the instrument could register. 2.5 minutes from Litchfield, they were decelerating and swinging slowly around Snagtooth, looking down on a tilted plateau that ended on the western side in a sheer drop of almost 1,000 feet. There were ruinous buildings on it, barracks and storehouses and offices, an airship dock and an air traffic control tower from which all the glass had long ago vanished, a great steel telecast tower that had fallen, crushing a couple of buildings. Young trees had already grown among the wreckage. Look over there, on the slope below it, there's one entrance to the shelters. There was a clearing among the evergreens, half a mile from the buildings, and raw earth, and a couple of big scows grounded near. They bulldozed rock and earth over the end of the tunnel. Then, there's another one down on that bench, a couple of 100 feet below the edge of the plateau. They blasted rock down over that. The main entrance is a vertical shaft under that pre-stressed concrete dome. That was chapel, auditorium, or something. They just covered it with sheet metal and poured a foot of concrete on top. They floated down above the broken roofs and crumbling walls, and grounded in the area between the main administration building and the offices, back of the ship docks. Once, he supposed, it had been a lawn. Then it had been a jungle. Now it was a scuffed, littered, bare-trodden workyard. Men were straggling out of the administration building, lighting pipes and cigarettes. They all wore new but work-soiled infantry battle dress. All of them waved and shouted greetings. One, about Conn's own age, approached. As he got out, Conn saw the resemblance to Lester Dawes, the banker, before he recognized Ance Dawes, who had been one of his closest friends 6 years ago. They shook hands and pounded each other on the back. "Hey, you're looking great, Conn." They all told him that. He'd begin to believe it pretty soon. "Sorry I couldn't make the party, but somebody had to sit on the lid here, and Jerry Reavers and I cut cards for it and Jerry won." "You didn't tell me Ance was with you," he reproached his father. Rodney Maxwell said he'd been saving that for a surprise. When Conn asked Ance what was the matter with the bank, he said, "For the birds, I'd as soon count sheets of toilet paper as this stuff we're using for money. Sooner. Toilet paper can be used for something, and this paper money's too stiff. Maybe some of this stuff we're digging here isn't worth much, but at least it's real." That was something else the Maxwell plan would have to take care of. Gresham's law was running hog-wild on Poictesme. A planetary government sol was worth about 10 centisols, Federation, and aside from deposit boxes, woolen socks under the mattress, and tin cans buried in the corner of the cellar, Federation currency was non-existent. "Had breakfast yet?" Rodney Maxwell asked. "Oh, hours ago. I was out and shot another spike nose. It's hanging up back of the kitchen, waiting for the cook to skin it and cut it up." He grinned at Conn. "You don't get this kind of hunting in a bank, either." "Jerry's still inside. I want to see him. Suppose you take Conn around and show him the sights. And don't worry about him bumping you out of a job. Worry about the 6 or 8 extra jobs you'll have to do besides your own, from now on." Conn and Ance crossed the yard and entered one of the office buildings, through a big breach in the wall. Ance said, "I did that myself, 90mm tank gun. When we want a wall out of the way, we get it out of the way." Inside were a lot of lifters and skids and power shovels and things Laboris were assembling for work assignments. Most of them had been with his father 6 years ago and he knew them. They hadn't done any growing up in the meantime. They climbed into an air jeep and floated out over the edge of the plateau, letting down past the sheer cliff to where the lower lateral shaft had been opened. A great deal of rock had been shoveled and bulldozed away to expose it. It was 20 feet high and 40 wide. Ance simply steered the jeep inside and up the tunnel. There were occasional lights on at the ceiling. Ance said they were all powered from their own nuclear electric conversion units. "We don't have the central power on here. There's a big mass energy converter, but we're tearing it down to ship out." That was something they could get a good price for. Maybe even 1/10 of what it was worth. At least they wouldn't have to sell it by the ton. The tunnel ended in an enormous room a couple of 100 feet square and 50 high. There was a wide aisle up the middle. On either side, contragravity equipment was massed. Tanks with long 90mm guns. Combat cars. Small airboats. Rank on rank of air cavalry single mounts, egg-shaped things just big enough for a man to sit in, with quadruple machine guns in front and flame jets behind. Ambulances armored against radiation, decontamination units, mobile workshops, mobile kitchens, troop carriers, jeeps, staff cars, power shovels, manipulators, lifters. All waiting, for 40 years, to swarm out as soon as the bombs that never came stopped falling. They floated the jeep along hallways beyond, and got down to look into rooms. Work was already going on in the power plant. A gang under a slim young man who Mance introduced as Mohammed Matsui were using repair robots to get canisters of live plutonium out of a reactor. Workshops, laundries, storerooms, kitchens, some stripped and a few still intact. A hospital, guardhouse and lockup. More storerooms on the level above, reached by returning to the vehicle hangar and lifting to an upper entrance. By this time, gangs were at work there, too, moving contragravity skids in empty and outloaded. The CO here must have had squirrel blood, Ant said. I think when the evacuation orders came through he just gathered up everything there was topside and crammed it down here, any old way. Honest to goo, this place was packed solid when we found it. Nobody'd believe it. Wait till you see the next one. You mean there's another place like this? You can say so. You can say a 20 megaton thermonuclear is like a hand grenade, too. Ant's doors simply didn't believe that. When they got back to the administration building on top, they found Rodney Maxwell, Jerry Reavers, the general foreman, and half a dozen gang foremen, in consultation. We're getting 150 more men and 10 farm scouts from Litchfield, his father said. Dave McCade's coming out from our yard, and Tom Brangwyn's sending one of his deputies to help boss them. We'll have to keep an eye on this crowd, they're all Tramptown hoodlums, but that's the best we can get. We're going to have to get this place cleaned out in a hurry. We only have about 2 weeks till the wine pressing's over, and then we want to start the next operation. Conn, did you see all that engineering equipment, down on the bottom level? Yes. I think we ought to leave a lot of that here, the shovels and bulldozers and manipulators and so on. We can move it direct to Force Command. How are we fixed for blasting explosives? Name it and we have it. Cataclysmite, FJ7, anything you want. We'll need a lot of it. We're going to have to get a ship. I mean a contragravity ship, a freighter, first, to move this stuff out of here, and then to move the stuff out of Force Command. And we want it mounted with heavy armament, too. We not only want a freighter, we want a fighting ship. You think so? I'm sure of it, Rodney Maxwell said. Where we're going is full of outlaws, there must be hundreds of them holing up over there. That's where all the trouble on the East Coast comes from. Now, outlaws are sure thing players. They want to be alive to spend their loot, and they won't tackle anything that's too tough for them. A lot of guards and combat equipment may look like a loss on the books, but the books won't show how much of a loss you might take if you didn't have them. I want this operation until it'll be too much for all the outlaws on the planet to tackle. That made sense. It also made sense out of the billions of souls the Federation had spent preparing for an invasion that never came. If it had come and found them unprepared, the loss might have been the war itself. The scows and the newly hired workers began arriving a little after noon. The scows had been borrowed from plantations where the crop had been gotten in. There were melon leaves and bits of vine in the bottoms. The workers were a bleary-eyed and unsavory lot. Conn had a suspicion, which Brangwyn's deputy confirmed, that they had been collected by mass vagrancy arrests in Tramptown. As soon as they started arriving, Jerry Reavers hurried down to the old Provost Marshal's headquarters and came back with a lot of rubber billy clubs, which he issued to his gang bosses, regular and temporary. A few times they had to be used. By evening, however, the insubordinate and troublesome had been quieted. They would all steal anything they could put in their pockets, but that was to be expected. By evening, too, the contents of the underground treasure trove was moving out in a steady stream, and scows were shuttling to and from Litchfield. Rodney Maxwell was going back to town after lunch the next day. Conn wanted to know if he should go along. No, you stay here, help keep things moving. Remember what I told you about the older and wiser heads. Let me handle them. I've been around them, heaven pity me, longer than you have. Just give me an audiovisual of your proxy and I'll vote your stock. How much stock do I have, by the way? The same as I have 10,500 shares of common, at 20 centisols a share. But watch where it goes after we open force command. Asterisk 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 asterisk. His father was back, 2 days later, to report. We're organized. Kurt Forsy's president, of course, and does he love it? That'll keep him out of mischief. Dolph Kelton's secretary, he has an office force at the academy and can conscript students to help. He's organizing a research team from his seniors and post-grad students to work in the planetary library at Storysend. There are a lot of old Third Force records there, he may find something useful. Of course, Lester Dawes is treasurer. What are you? Vice president in charge of operations. That's what I spent all yesterday log rolling, baby kissing and cigar passing to get. And what am I, if it's a fair question? You have a very distinguished position, you are a non-office holding stockholder. The only other one is Judge Ledoux. As a member of the judiciary, he did not feel it proper to accept official position in a private corporation. Tom Brangwyn's chief of company police, Clem Forsey is commander of the company guards. And we have a law firm in Storysend lined up to handle our charter application. Sturber, Flynn and Chenwong. Sturber's married to Jake Vickhoven's sister, Flynn's son is married to the daughter of the Secretary of the Treasury, and Chenwong is a nephew of the Chief Justice. All of them are directly descended from members of Genji Gartner's original crew. You don't anticipate any trouble about getting the charter? Not exactly. And Lester Dawes is in Storysend now, trying to find us a contragravity ship. There are about a dozen in the hands of receivers for bankrupt shipping companies, he might find one that's still airworthy. Oh, you remember how I insisted on absolute secrecy about our Merlin objective? That's working out better than my fondest expectations. It's leaking like a machine-gunned water tank, and everybody it leaks to is positive that we know exactly where Merlin is or we wouldn't be trying to keep it a secret. Asterisk 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 asterisk. 3 days later, Conn hitched a ride on a freight scow to Litchfield. From the air, he could see a haze of bonfire smoke over High Garden Terrace, and a gang of men at work. There were more men at work on the mall and along the streets on either side. He went up from the yard below the house, where the scow was being unloaded, and found his mother in the living room watching a screenplay with one eye and keeping the other on a soulless machine like a miniature contragravity tank, which was going over the carpet with a vacuum cleaner and taking swipes at the furniture with a rotary dust mop. She was glad to see him, and then became troubled. Conn, when Flora comes home, you won't argue with her, will you? Only in self-defense. That was the wrong thing to say. He changed it to, no, I won't argue with her at all, and then quoted Wade Lucas quoting Thomas Paine. Then he had to assure his mother a couple of times that there really was a Merlin, and then assure her that it wouldn't get loose and hurt anybody if he did find it. In the middle of his assurances about the harmlessness of Merlin, the house-cleaning robot began knocking things off the top of a table. Oscar! You stop that, his mother yelled. Oscar, deaf as the adder, kept on. Conn yelled at his mother to use her control. She remembered that she had won, a thing like an old-fashioned pocket watch, around her neck on a chain, and got the robot stopped. No wonder she was afraid of Merlin. He took advantage of the interruption to get to his room and change clothes, then went up to the hangar and got out an air cavalry mount. About 50 men were working on High Garden Terrace, pruning and trimming and leveling the lawns. There was a big vitrifier on the mall. Even at 500 feet he could feel the heat from it, chuffing and clanking and pouring lava like molten rock for a new pavement. And all the nymphs and satyrs and dryads and fauns and centaurs had had their pedestals rebuilt and were sandblasted clean. He landed on the top of the airline's building and rode a lift down to the office where Kurt Forsey neglected the affairs of his shipline agency, his brokerage business, and the city of Litchfield. The afternoon habitués had begun to gather: Raymond Fitch, the used vehicles dealer, Lorenzo Menards, Judge Ledoux, Tom Brangwyn, Clems R.F. Forsey was on the screen, talking to somebody with sandy hair and a suit that didn't seem to be made of any sort of Federation Armed Forces material, about warehouse facilities. The addresses they were mentioning were in Storysend. "No, Leo, I don't know when," Forsey was saying, "but don't you worry. You just have space for it, and we'll fill it up. And don't ask me what sort of stuff. You know what a salvage operation's like, you just haul out the stuff as you come to it." Tom Brangwyn, lounging in one of the deep chairs, looked up. "Hello, Conn. We're having a time. Another 200 tramps came in on the Countess this morning, and goo only knows how many in their own vehicles, and they all seem to think if there's work for some there ought to be work for all, and some of them are getting nasty. We can use some more out at the dig. The ones you sent out Thursday are doing all right, once they found out we weren't taking any foolishness." Forsey turned away from the screen. "Well, Conn, we're in," he said. "The charter was granted this morning, now we're Litchfield Exploration and Salvage, Limited. And Lester Dawes has found us a contragravity ship. How much will it cost us?" Forsey began to laugh. "Conn, this'll slay you. She isn't costing us a centisol. You know those old ships on Mothball Row, back of the old West End ship docks at Storysend?" Conn nodded. He'd seen them before he had gone away, and from the city of Asgard coming in a lot of old army transport craft, covered with muslin and sprayed with protectoplast. The planetary government had taken them over after the war and forgotten them. "Well, Lester's getting one of them for us under the old 878 Commercial Enterprise Encouragement Act. She's an Army combat freighter, regimental ammunition ship. Of course, she still has armament, we'll have to pay to get that off." "Why?" Forsey looked at him in surprise. "It would only be in the way and I'd wait. We want her for a cargo ship, don't we? That's what she was built for." "What kind of armament?" Forsey didn't know. Clems R.F. did. For 115mm rifles, 2 fore and 2 aft. A pair of lift-and-drive missile launchers amidships. And a secondary gun battery of 70mm and 50mm autocannon. I know the class, we captured a few of them. Good ships. Forsey was horrified. "Why, that's more firepower than the whole air patrol. Look, the government won't like our having anything like that." "They're giving her to us, aren't they?" Menards asked. "Gehenna with what the government likes," the old rebel swore. "If they put a few of those ships into commission, they could wipe out these outlaws and a private company wouldn't need an armed ship." "May I use your screen, Kurt?" Conn asked. When Forsey nodded, he punched out the combination of the operating office at 10th Army, and finally got his father on. He told him about the ship. "There's talk about tearing the armament out," he added. "Is that so, now? Well, I'll call Lester Dawes before he can get started on it. I think I'll go into Storysend tomorrow and see the ship for myself. See what I can do about ammunition for those guns, too." "But, Rod," Forsey protested, joining the conversation, "we don't want to start a war." "No. We want to stay out of one. You don't do that by disarming. We're taking that ship down into the Badlands. Remember?" Rodney Maxwell said. "Ever hear the name Blackie Prawless?" Fawzi had. He stopped arguing about armament. Instead, he began worrying about how much the civic cleanup campaign was costing Lichfield. You think we really need that, Rod? Of course we do. You'd be surprised how much labor we're going to need, and how hard up we're going to be for capable supervisors. This thing's a training program, Kurt, and we'll need every man we train on it. But it's costing like Niflheim, Rod. We're going to bankrupt the city. Worse than it is now, you mean? Oh, don't worry, Kurt. As soon as we find Merlin, everything'll be all right. Franz Veltring came in, shortly after Rodney Maxwell was off the screen. He dropped his audiovisual camera and sound recorder on the table, laid his pistol belt on top of them and took a drink of brandy, downing it with the audible satisfaction of a thirsty horse at a trough. Then he looked around accusingly. Somebody's been talking, he declared. I've had all the news services on the planet on my screen today. They all want the story about what's happening here. They've heard we know where Merlin is, that Conn Maxwell found out on Terra. They just put 2 and 2 together and threw 7, Conn said. A Herald Guardian ship news reporter interviewed me when I got in, and found out I'd been studying cybernetics and computer theory on Terra. What did you tell them? Complete denial. We don't know a thing about Merlin. Naturally, they didn't believe me. A bunch of them are coming out here tomorrow. What are we going to tell them? We'll all have to have the same story. I, said Judge Ledoux, am not going to be interviewed. I am leaving town till they're gone. Why don't you steer them on to Wade Lucas? Conn asked. If you want anything denied, he'll do it for you. Everybody thought that was a wonderful idea, except Clem Zaref, and he waited until Conn was ready to go and rode up to the landing stage with him. Conn, I know this Lucas is going to marry your sister, he began, but how much do you know about him? Not much. He seems like a nice chapter. I don't hold what he said at the meeting against him. I suppose if I'd come from off-planet, I wouldn't believe in Merlin either. Ha! But doesn't he believe in Merlin? He makes noises like it. You know what I think? Clem Zaref lowered his voice to a whisper. I think he's a Federation spy. I think the Federation's lost Merlin. That's why they haven't come back to get it long ago. Pretty big thing to mislay. It could happen. There'd only be a few scientists and some high staff officers who'd know where it was. Well, say they all went back to Terra on the same ship, and the ship was lost at space. Sabotage, one of our commerce raiders that hadn't heard the war was over, maybe just an ordinary accident. But the ship's lost, and the location of Merlin's lost with her. That could happen, Conn agreed seriously. All right. So ever since, they've had people here, listening, watching, spying. This Lucas, he showed up here about a year after you went to Terra. And who does he get engaged to? Your sister. And what does he do here? Goes around arguing that there is no Merlin, getting people to argue with him, getting them mad, so they'll blurt out anything they know. I'm an old field officer, I know all the prisoner interrogation tricks in the book, and that's always been one of the best. Then why did he act the way he did at the meeting? All he did there was cut himself off from learning anything more from any of us. In his place, would you have done that? No, you'd have tried to take the lead in hunting for Merlin yourself. Now wouldn't you? Zaref was silent, first puzzled, and then hurt. Now he would have to tear the whole idea down and build it over. Flora was quite friendly when she came home from school. She'd found out, somewhere, that Conn had been the originator of the municipal facelifting project. He was tempted, briefly, to tell her a little, if not all, of the truth about the Maxwell plan, then decided against it. The way to keep a secret was to confide it to nobody. Every time you did, you doubled, maybe even squared, the chances of exposure. He told his father, when Rodney Maxwell came in from the dig, about his talk with Clem's RF. "How long's he been like that, anyhow?" he asked. "As long as I've known him. When it comes to melons and wine and bossing tramp labor and taking care of his money and coming in out of the rain, Clem's RF's as sane as I am. But on the subject of the Terran Federation, he's crazy as a bedbug." "What is a bedbug, anyhow?" "They have them on Terra, in places like Tramptown. They have places like Tramptown on Terra, too." "Ooh. I suppose, in Clem's boots, I'd be just as crazy as he is," Rodney Maxwell said. One minute, he had a wife and 2 children in Kindleberg, on Ashmedai, and the next minute Kindleberg was a puddle of radioactive slag. "That was in 51, wasn't it?" "I read about it," Conn said. "It was a famous victory." "That was from a poem, too." Asterisk 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 asterisk. Rodney Maxwell flew to Storisend early the next morning. Conn rode back to 10th Army on an empty scow and pitched into the job of getting the stores and equipment out of the underground shelters. More farm tramps arrived, and had to be pounded into obedience and taught the work. At the same time, Litchfield was getting a steady influx of job seekers, and a secondary swarm of thugs, grifters, and gangsters who followed them. Clem's RF, having gotten all his melons pressed, came out to 10th Army, where he selected 50 of the best men from the work gangs and began drilling them as soldiers to guard the next operation. The manual of arms, drill and salute he taught them was, of course, System States Alliance. A week later, the ship arrived from Storisend, 160 feet, 3,000 tons, small enough to be berthed inside a hyperspace transport, and fast enough to get a load of ammunition to troops at the front, unload, and get out again before the enemy could zero in on her, and armed to fight off any Army Air Force combat craft. The delay had been in recruiting officers and crew. The captain and chief engineer were out-of-work shipline officers, the gunner was a former Federation artillery officer, and the crew looked more like pirates than most pirates did. They christened her the Leicester Dawes, because Dawes had secured her and because the name began with the initials of Litchfield Exploration and Salvage. From then on, it was a race to see whether the 10th Army attack shelters would be emptied before the wine was all pressed, or vice versa. Chapter 7. 52 years before, they had come to the mesa in the Badlands and dug a pit on top of it, 1,000 feet in diameter and more than 500 deep, and in it they built a duplicate of the headquarters for 3rd Fleet Army Force Command. They built a shaft 100 feet in diameter like a chimney at one side, and they ran a tunnel out through solid rock to the head of a canyon half a mile away. Then they buried the whole thing. 12 years later, when the war was over, they sealed both entrances and went away and left it. For a month each winter, cold rains from the east lashed the desert. For the rest of the year, it was swept by wind-blown sand. Ryegrass sprouted, and thornbush grew. Nature, the master camoufleur, completed the work of hiding the forgotten headquarters. Little things not unlike rabbits scampered over it, and bigger things, vaguely fox-like, hunted them. Hunted men came, too, their aircars skimming low. None of them had the least idea what was underneath. The mesa top came suddenly to life, just as the sun edged up out of the east. Conn and his father and Aunt Dawes came in first, in the wrecking car with which they had scouted and photographed the site a few days before. They circled at 1,000 feet, fired a smoke bomb, and then let down near where Conn's map showed the head of the vertical shaft. The rest followed, first a couple of combat cars that circled slowly, scanning the ground, and then the Leicester Dawes with her big guns and her load of equipment, and behind a queue of boats and scows and heavy engineering equipment on contragravity and troop carriers full of workmen and guards, flanked by air cavalry, which circled above while everything else landed, then scattered out over a 50-mile radius. Occasionally there was a hammering of machine guns, either because somebody saw something on the ground that might need shooting at or simply because it was a beautiful morning to make a noise. The ship settled quickly and daintily, while Conn and Ants and Rodney Maxwell sat in the car and watched. Immediately, she began opening like a beetle bursting from its shell, large sections of armor swinging outward. Except for the bridge and the gun turrets, almost the whole ship could be opened. She had been designed to land in the middle of a battle and deliver ammunition when seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Jeeps and lifters and manipulators and things floated out of her. Scows began landing and unloading prefab hut elements. A water tank landed, and the cook shed began going up beside it. A lorry came in with scanning and probing equipment, and a couple of men jumped off and huddled over a photoprint copy of one of Conn's maps. Conn lifted the car again and coasted it half a mile to where the cleft in the mesa started. There were half a dozen claw-armed manipulators already there, and 2 giant power shovels. Jerry Reavers and one of the engineers Kurt Forsey had hired had gotten out of a jeep and were looking at another photoprint of the map. Reavers pointed to the head of the canyon, where a mass of rock had slid down. "That's it, you can still see where they put off the shots." The canyon was long enough and wide enough for the Lester doors to land in it. She could be loaded directly from the tunnel. The manipulators began moving in, wrestling with the larger chunks of rock and dragging or carrying them away. Power shovels began grunting and clanking and rumbling. Dust rose in a thick column. Toward mid-morning, the troop carriers which served as school buses in Litchfield arrived, loaded with more workmen. A lorry-lettered Storysend Herald Guardian came in, hovered over the canyon, and began transmitting audiovisuals. More newsfolk put in an appearance. The earth and rock at the top of the tunnel entrance fell away, revealing the vitrified stone lintel. Everybody cheered and dug harder. More aircars arrived, getting in each other's and everybody else's way. Raymond Fitch, Lester Dawes, Lorenzo Menards, and Morgan Gatworth. Dolph Kelton, playing hooky from school. Kurt Forsey, he landed in the canyon and watched every shovelful of rock lifted, as though trying to help with mental force. Tom Brangwyn, with a score of the Home Guard to reinforce the company police. Clem Zaref called in his air cavalry to help control the sightseers. Nobody was making trouble, they were just getting in the way. At 11, Rodney Maxwell went aboard the Lester Dawes to use the radio and telescreen equipment. By then, 2 time zones west in Storysend, the claims office was opening. He filed preliminary claim to an underground installation with at least 2 entrances in uninhabited country, and claimed a 10-mile radius around it. By that time, the gang working on top had uncovered a vitrified slab over the 100-foot circle of the vertical shaft and were cracking it with explosives. According to the scanners, it was full of loose rubble for 100 feet down. Below that, the microrays hit something impenetrable. Toward mid-afternoon, the tunnel in the canyon was cleared. It had been vitrified solid. The scanners reported that it was plugged for 10 feet. A contragravity tank let down in front of it, with a solenoid jackhammer mounted where the gun should have been, and began pounding, running a hole in for a blast shot. There were more explosions topside. When Conn took a jeep up to observe progress there, he found the vitrified rock blown completely off the vertical shaft, exposing the rubble that had been dumped into it. The gang on the mesa top had discovered something else, a grid of orocopper bus bars buried 4 feet underground. 10-to-1, radio and telescreen signals would be transmitted to that from below, and then probably picked up and rebroadcast from a relay station on one or another of the high buttes in the neighborhood. Time enough to look for that later. He returned to the canyon, where the lateral tunnel was now almost completely open. When it was clear, they sent a snooper in first. It was a robot, looking slightly like a short-tailed tadpole, 6 feet long by 3 feet at the thickest. It transmitted a view of the tunnel as it went slowly in. The air, it found, was breathable, and there were no harmful radiations or other dangers. According to the plans, there should be a big room at the other end, slightly curved, 100 feet wide by 100 on either side of the tunnel entrance. The robot entered this, and in its headlight they could see reconnaissance cars, and contragravity tanks with 90mm guns. It swerved slightly to the left, and then the screen stopped receiving. the telemetered instruments went dead and the robot's signal stopped. "Tom," Rodney Maxwell said, "you keep the crowd back. Clem, stay with the screens, I'll transmit to you. I'm going in to see what's wrong." He started to give Conn an argument when he wanted to accompany him. "No," Conn said. "I'm going along. What do you think I went to Terra to study robotics for?" His father snapped on the screen and pickup of the Jeep that was standing nearby. "You getting it, Clem?" he asked. "Okay, Conn. Let's go." Half a mile ahead, at the other end of the tunnel, they could see a flicker of light that grew brighter as they advanced. The snooper still had its light on and was moving about. Once they caught a momentary signal from it. As Rodney Maxwell piloted the Jeep, Conn kept talking to Clem's RF, outside. Then they were at the end of the tunnel and entering the room ahead. It was full of vehicles, like the one on the bottom level at 10th Army HQ. As soon as they were inside, Clem's RF's voice in the radio stopped, as though the set had been shot out. "Clem? What's wrong?" "We aren't getting you," his father was saying. The snooper was drifting aimlessly about, avoiding the parked vehicles. Conn used the manual control to set it down and deactivate it, then got out and went to examine it. "Take the Jeep over to the tunnel entrance," he told his father. "Move out into the tunnel a few feet, relay from me to Clem." The Jeep moved over. A moment later his father cried, "He's getting me, I'm getting him. What's the matter with the radio in here? The snooper's all right, isn't it?" It was. Conn reactivated it and put it up above the tops of the vehicles. "Sure. We just can't transmit out." "But only half a mile of rock, that set's good for more than that. It'll transmit clear through Snagtooth." "It won't transmit through Collapsium." His father swore disgustedly, repeating it to Zaref outside. Conn could hear the old soldier, in the radio, make a similar remark. They should have all expected that, in the first place. If the Third Force High Command was expecting to sit out a nuclear bombardment in this place, they'd armor it against anything. "Bring the gang in, it's safe as far as we've gotten," his father said. "We'll just have to string wires out." Conn used his flashlight and found the power unit for the room lights. All the overhead lights were wired to one unit, if wired were the word for gold leaf circuits cemented to the walls and covered with insulating paint. For the heavy stuff, like the ventilator fans, they'd have to find the central power plant. He looked around the big room, poking into some of the closets that lined it. Radiation-proof clothing. Tools. Arms and ammunition. First aid kits. Emergency rations. All the vehicles were plated in shimmering collapsium. The crowd started coming in, the work gangs selected for the first exploration work, most of them old hands of Rodney Maxwell's, the engineers they had recruited. Mohammed Matsui, he had a gang of his own, the same one he had been using in tearing down the converter at 10th Army, the stockholders and officials, the press. And everybody else Tom Brangwyn's police hadn't been able to keep out. The power plant was at the extreme bottom. Matsui began looking it over at once. Above it they found the service facilities, air and water plant, pumps for the artesian well, sewage disposal. Then repair ships, and a laboratory, and laundries, and kitchens above that. "Where do you suppose it is?" Kurt Forsey was asking. "Up at the very top, I suppose. Let's go up and work down. I can't wait till we've found it." Like a kid on Christmas Eve, Conn thought. And there was no Santa Claus, and Christmas had been abolished. The place was built in concentric circles, level above level. Combat equipment nearest the tunnel exit and nearest the vertical shaft, and ambulances and decontamination units and equipment for relief and rebuilding next. Storerooms, mile on circular mile of them. Not the hasty pack rat cramming he'd seen at 10th Army. Everything had been brought in order, carefully piled or racked, and then left. more stores for the next 3 levels up, then living quarters. Enlisted men's and women's quarters, no signs of occupancy. Enlisted kitchens and mess halls, untouched. Most of the officers' quarters were similarly unused, but here and there some had been occupied. A sloppily made bed. A used cake of soap in the bathroom. An empty bottle in a closet. Officers' commissary stores had been used from and replaced, the officers' mess hall and kitchen had been in constant use, and the officers' club had a comfortably scuffed and lived-in look. There had been a few people there all the time of the war. Men and women, all officers, or civilians, Clem Zaref said. Didn't even have enlisted men to cook for them. And we haven't found a scrap of paper with writing on it, or an inch of recorded sound tape or audiovisual film. Remember those big wire baskets, down at the mass energy converters? Before they left, they disintegrated every scrap of writing or recording. This is where Merlin is, they were the people who worked with it. And above, officers. General Staff. War planning, with an incredibly complex star map of the theatre of war. Judge Advocate General. Inspector General. Service of Supply. They were full of computers, each one firing the hopes of people like Fawzi and Dolph Kelton and Judge Ledoux, but they were only special-purpose machines, the sort to be found in any big business office. The Storysense Stock Exchange probably had much bigger ones. Then they found big ones, rank on rank of cabinets, long consoles studded with lights and buttons, programming machines. It's Merlin! Fawzi almost screamed. We've found it! One of the reporters who had followed them in snatched his radio handphone from his belt and jabbered, then, realizing that the collapsium shielding kept him from getting out with it, he replaced it and bolted away. Hold it! Conn yelled at the others, who were also becoming hysterical. Wait till I take a look at this thing. They managed to calm themselves. After all, he should know what it was, wasn't that why he'd gone to school on terror? They followed him from machine to machine, first hopefully and then fearfully. Finally he turned, shaking his head and feeling like the doctor in a film show, telling the family that there's no hope for Grandpa. This is not Merlin. This is the personnel file machine. It's taped for the records and data of every man and woman in the Third Force for the whole war. It's like the student record machine at the university. Might have known it, this section in here's marked G1 all over everything, that's personnel. Wouldn't have Merlin in here, Clem Zaref was saying. Well, we'll just keep on hunting for it till we do find it, Kurt Fawzi said. It's here somewhere. It has to be. The next level up was much smaller. Here were the offices of the top echelons of the Force Command Staff. They, unlike the ones below, had been used, from them, too, every scrap of writing or film or record tape had vanished. Finally, they entered the private office of Force General Fox Travis. It had not only been used, it was in disorder. Ashtrays full, many of the 40-year-old cigarette ends lipstick tinted. Chairs shoved around at random. 3 bottles on the desk, with Terran bourbon labels, 2 empty and 1 with about an inch of whiskey left in it. But no glasses. That bothered Conn somehow. He couldn't quite picture the commander and staff of the 3rd Fleet Army Force passing bottles around and drinking from the neck. Then he noticed that the wall across the room was strangely scarred and scratched. Dropping his eye to the floor under it, he caught the twinkle of broken glass. They had gathered here, and talked for a long time. Then they had risen, for a final toast, and when it was drunk, they had hurled their glasses against the wall and smashed them. Then they had gone out, leaving the broken glass and the empty bottles, knowing that they would never return. Chapter 8. Before they returned to the lower level into which the lateral tunnel entered, Matsui and his gang had the power plant going, the ventilator fans were humming softly, and whenever they pressed a starting button, the escalators began to move. They got the pumps going, and the oxygen generators, and the sewage disposal system. Until the communication center could be checked and the relay station found, they ran a cable out to the Leicester doors, landed in the canyon, and used her screen and radio equipment. Before the claims office in Storesend closed, Rodney Maxwell had transmitted in recorded views of the interior, and enough of a description for a final claim. They also received teleprint copies of the Storesend papers. The first story, in an extra edition of the Herald Guardian, was headlined, "Merlin Found." That would have been the reporter who bolted off prematurely when they first saw the personnel record machines. Conn wondered if he still had a job. A later edition corrected this, but was full of extravagant accounts of what had been discovered. Merlin or no Merlin, Force Command duplicate was the biggest abandoned property discovery since the Third Force left the Tri-System. The camp they had set up on top of the mesa was used, that night, only by Clem's RF's guards. Everybody else was inside, eating cold rations when hungry and, when they could keep awake no longer, bedding down on piles of blankets or going up to the barracks rooms above. The next day they found the relay station which rebroadcast signals from the buried aerial, or wouldn't one say, subterrial, on top of the mesa. As Conn had expected, it was on top of a high butte 3.5 miles to the south. It had been so skillfully camouflaged that none of the outlaw bands who roamed the Badlands had found it. After that, Force Command duplicate was in communication with the rest of Poictesme. They moved into the staff headquarters at the top. Fox Travis's office, tidied up, became the headquarters for the company officials and chief supervisors. The workmen quartered themselves in the enlisted barracks, helping themselves liberally to anything they found. The crowds of sightseers kept swarming in, giving Tom Brangwyn's police plenty to do. Tom himself turned the marshal's office in Lichfield over to his chief deputy. Clem's RF insisted on more men for his guard force. A dozen gunboats, 80-foot craft mounting one 90mm gun, several smaller autocannon and one missile launcher, had been found. He took them over immediately, naming them for capital ships of the old system states navy. It took some argument to dissuade him from repainting all of them black and green. He kept them all in the air, with a swarm of smaller airboats and combat cars, circling the underground headquarters at a radius of 100 miles. These patrols reported a general exodus from the region. At least a dozen outlaw bands, all with fast contragravity, had been camped inside the zone. Some fled at once, the rest needed only a few warning shots to send them away. Other bands, looking like legitimate prospecting parties, began to filter into the Badlands. Zaref came to Rodney Maxwell instead of Kurt Forsey, the titular head of the company, which was significant, to find out what policy regarding them would be. "Well, we have no right to keep them out, as long as they stay outside our 10-mile radius," Conn's father said. "And as we're the only thing that even looks like law around here, I'd say we have an obligation to give them protection. Have your boats investigate them. If they're legitimate, tell them they can call on us for help if they need it." Conn protested, privately. "There's a lot of stuff around here, in small caches," he said. "Equipment for guerrilla companies, in event of invasion. When work slacks off here, we could pick that stuff up." "Conn, there's an old stock market maxim, a bear can make money sometimes, and a bull can make money sometimes, but in the long run, a hog always loses. Let the other people find some of this, it'll all help the plan. Fact is, I've been thinking of leaking some information, if I can do it without Forsey and that gang finding out. Do you know a good supply depot or something like that, say over on Acare, or on the West Coast? Big enough to be important, and to start a second prospectors rush away from us. How about one of those hospitals?" "No, not a hospital. We might use them to talk Wade Lucas into joining us. A lot of medical stores would be a good bait for him. I'm afraid he's going to make trouble if we don't do something about him." "Well, how about engineering and construction equipment? I know where there's a lot of that, down to the southwest. That's farming country, that stuff will be useful down there. I'll do that." The next morning, Rodney Maxwell scorched the stratosphere to Storesend in his Recon car. The day after he got back, there was a big discovery of engineering equipment to the southwest and, as he had anticipated, a second rush of prospectors. They had the vertical shaft clear now, and the Leicester Dawes was shuttling back and forth between Force Command Duplicate and Storesend. Other ships were coming in, now, mostly privately owned freighting ships. They bought almost anything, as fast as it came out. The stock market had been paralyzed for a couple of days after the discovery of Force Command. Nobody seemed to know what to sell and what to hold. Now it was going perfectly insane. 20 or 30 new companies were being formed. Unlike Litchfield Exploration and Salvage, they were all offering their stock to the public. A week after the opening of Force Command, the stock exchange reported the first 500,000 share day since the war. A week after that, there were 2 million share days in succession. Some of the L, E, and S stockholders who had come out on the first day began drifting back to Litchfield. Leicester Dawes was the first to defect. There was nothing he could do at Force Command, and a great deal that needed his personal attention at the bank. Morgan Gatworth and Lorenzo Menards and one or two others followed. Kurt Forsey, however, refused to leave. Merlin was somewhere here at Force Command, he was sure of it, and he wasn't leaving till it was found. Neither were Franz Veltrin or Dolph Kelton or Judge Ledoux. Tom Brangwyn resigned as town marshal. Clem Zaref was too busy even to think of Merlin. He had almost as many men under his command, and twice as much contragravity, as he had had when the System States Alliance Army had surrendered. Conn flew to Litchfield, and found that the Public Works project had come to a stop at noon of the day when Force Command was entered, and that nothing had been done on it since. The cold vitrifier was still standing in the middle of the mall, and topside Litchfield was littered in a dozen places with forsaken equipment and half-completed paving. There was no one in Kurt Forsey's office in the airlines building, and the employment office was jammed with migratory workers vainly seeking jobs. He hunted up Morgan Gatworth, the lawyer. "Can't some of you get things started again?" he wanted to know. "This place is worse than it was before they started cleaning up." "Yes, I know." Gatworth walked to an open window and looked down on the littered mall. "But everybody just dropped everything as soon as you opened Force Command. Kurt Forsey's not been back here since." "Well, you're here. Leicester Dawes and Lorenzo Menards are here. Why don't you just take over? Kurt Forsey couldn't care less what you do. He's forgotten he is mayor of Litchfield. He's forgotten there is a Litchfield. Well, I don't like to just move into the mayor's office and take over." From somewhere below, a submachine gun hammered. There were yells, pistol shots, and the submachine gun hammered again, a couple of short bursts. "Some of the farm tramps who can't get jobs, trying to steal something to eat, I suppose," Conn commented. Gatworth was frowning thoughtfully. "He'd only need one more, very slight, push. Why don't you talk to Wade Lucas? He's got brains, and he's honest. Nobody but an honest man would have made himself as unpopular as Lucas has. If you pretend to be disillusioned with this Merlin business, it might help convince him. He was blaming you and your father for what's been going on here in the last 2 weeks. Yes. He'd help get things straightened out." At home, he found his mother simply dazed. She was happy to see him, and solicitous about his and his father's health. It seemed at times, though, as if he was somebody she had never met before. Events had gotten so far beyond her that she wasn't even trying to catch up. Flora, returning from school, stopped short when she saw him. "Well, I hope you like what you've done," she greeted him. "For a start, yes." "For a start? You know what you've done?" "Yes. I don't know what you think I've done, though." "Tell me." "You've turned everything into a madhouse. You've sent this whole world Merlin crazy. Look at the stock market. You look at it. All I can see is a pack of lunatics playing Russian roulette with 5 chambers loaded out of 6. Some of this so-called stock that's being peddled around isn't worth 5 millisols a share. Seekers for Merlin, Limited, closed today at 170. You notice, there isn't any L, E, and S being traded. If you don't believe me, talk to Lester Dawes, he'll tell you what we think of this market. Well, it's your fault. In part it's my fault that any of these quarterwits have any money to play the market with. They wouldn't have money enough to play a 5-centisol slot machine if we hadn't gotten a little business started. There was just a little truth to that, too. A few woolen socks were coming out from under mattresses, and a few tin cans were being exhumed in cellars, since the new flood of Federation equipment and supplies had gotten on the market. He'd seen a freshly lettered sign on Len Yeniguchi's tailor shop, quarter price in Federation currency. That night, however, he had one of the nightmares he used to have as a child, a dream of climbing up onto a huge machine and getting it started, and then clinging, helpless and terrified, unable to stop it as it went faster and faster toward destruction. Asterisk 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 asterisk. Clem Zareff's patrols were encountering larger outlaw bands, the result of gang mergers. They were fighting with prospecting parties, and prospecting parties were fighting one another. Much of this was making the newscasts. One battle, between 2 regularly chartered prospecting companies, lasted 3 days, with an impressive casualty list. Public demands were growing that the planetary government do something about the situation. The government was wondering what to do, or how. There were indignant questions in Parliament. Finally, the government dragged a couple of armed ships off Mothball Row, a combat freighter like the Leicester Dawes, and a big assault transport, and began trying to get them into commission. And, of course, the market boom was still on. The newscasts were full of that, too. He had started worrying about if a bust came, now he was worrying about what would happen when it did. Another good reason for wanting to get to Koshche and getting a hypership built. When the bust came, he and his father would want one, very badly. In any case, it was time to begin getting an expedition ready for Barathrum spaceport. Quite a few of the new companies had large contragravity craft, and the nascent planetary air navy was approaching a state of being. He wanted to get out there before anybody else did. Maybe if they got the hypership built soon enough, it would start a second, sound boom that would cushion the crash of the present speculative market when it came, as come it must. He talked to Clem Zareff about borrowing a couple of the 80-foot gunboats. Zareff's attitude was automatically negative. We mustn't weaken our defense perimeter, we'd be inviting disaster. Why, this whole country in here is simply swarming with outlaws. They fired on one of our gunboats, the Werewolf, yesterday. He'd heard about that. Somebody had launched a missile from the ground, and the Werewolf had detonated it with a counter-missile. It had probably been some legitimate prospecting company who'd taken the L, E, and S craft for a pirate. And there was a battle down in the Devil's Pigpen day before yesterday. That had been outlaws. They had been annihilated by something calling itself Seekers for Merlin, Limited, whose stock was still skyrocketing on the exchange. He mentioned that these other prospecting companies are doing a lot of our outlaw fighting for us, and as long as the country's full of small independent parties, the outlaws go after them and leave us alone. Yes, and I have my doubts about a lot of these prospecting companies, and a lot of the outlaws, too, Zareff said. I think a lot of both are Federation agents. They are waiting till we find Merlin, and then they'll all jump us. Well, Conn adjusted his argument to the old rebel's obsession. I'll admit that, as a possibility. If so, we'll need heavier weapons than we have. This spaceport on Barathrum might be just the place to get them. Yes. It might. Defense armament, and stored ships' weapons. Say, if we grab that place and move all the heavy guns and missiles here, we could stand off anybody. The thought of a fight with minions of the Terran Federation seemed to have shaved 10 years off his age in a twinkling. You take the Leicester doors, and, let's say, 3 of these gunboats. Let me see. Goblin, Fred Karski. And Vampire, Charlie Gatworth. And Dragon, Stefan Jorison. They're all good men. Home Guard, trained them myself. Aren't you coming, Colonel? Oh, I'd like to, Conn, but I can't. I don't want to be away from here, no telling what might happen. But you keep in constant screen contact. If you get into any trouble, I'll come with everything I can put into the air. Chapter 9. Barathrum was a grim land, naked black and grey. Spines and crags of bare rock jutted up, lava flows like black glacier twisting among them. It was split by faults and fissures, pimpled with ash cones. Except for the seabirds that nested among the cliffs and the few thin patches of green where seeds windblown from the mainland had taken root, it was as lifeless as when some ancient convulsion had thrust it up from the sea. Barathrum was a dead inferno, and tenanted even by the damned. By comparison, the Badlands seemed lushly fertile. The 4 craft crossed above the line of white breakers that marked the division of sea and land, the gunboat Goblin in the lead, her sisters, Vampire and Dragon to right and left and a little behind, and the Leicester doors a few miles in the rear. Fred Karski was at the Goblin's controls. Conn, beside him, was peering ahead into the teleview screen and shifting his eyes from it to the map and back again. Somebody behind him was saying that it would be a nice place to be erect. Somebody else was telling him not to joke about it. From the radio, his father was asking, "Can you see it, yet?" "Not yet. We're on the right map and compass direction, we should before long." "We're picking up radiation," Fred Karski said. "Way above normal count. I hope the place isn't hot." "We're getting that, too," Rodney Maxwell said. "Looks like power radiation, something must be on there." After 40 years, that didn't seem likely. He leaned over to look at the Omnigeiger, then whistled. If that was normal leakage from inactive power units, there must be enough of them to power 10 towns the size of Litchfield. "Something's operating there," he said, and then realized what that meant. Somebody had beaten them to the spaceport. That would be one of the new companies formed after the opening of Force Command. He was wishing, now, that he hadn't let himself be talked out of coming here first. Older and wiser heads indeed. Fred Karski whistled shrilly into his radio phone. "Attention everybody. General alert. Prepare for combat, prepare to take immediate evasive action. We must assume that the spaceport is occupied, and that the occupants are hostile. Captain Poole, will you please make ready aboard your ship? Reduce both speed and altitude, and ready your guns and missiles at once." "Well, now, wait a minute, young fellow," Poole began to argue. "You don't know." "No. I don't. And I want all of us alive after we find out, too," Karski replied. Rodney Maxwell's voice, in the background, said something indistinguishable. Poole said ungraciously, "Well, all right, if you think so." The Leicester doors began dropping to the rear and going down toward the ground. Conn returned to the teleview screen in time to see the truncated cone of the extinct volcano rise on the horizon, dwarfing everything around it. Fred Karski was talking to Colonel Zaref, back at Force Command, giving him the radiation count. "That's occupied," the old soldier replied. "Mass energy converter going. Now, Fred, don't start any shooting unless you have to, but don't get yourself blown to MC waiting on them to fire the first shot." The dark cone bulked higher and higher in the screen. It must be 7 miles around the crater, and a mile deep. When that thing blew out, 10 or 15,000 years ago, it must have been something to see, preferably from a ship 1,000 miles off-planet. It was so huge that it was hard to realize that the jumbled foothills around it were themselves respectably lofty mountains. When they were within 5 miles of it, something twinkled slightly near the summit. An instant later, the missileman, in his turret overhead, shouted. "Missile coming up, counter-missile off. Grab onto something, everybody!" Karski yelled, bracing himself in his seat. Conn, on his feet, flung his arms around an upright stanchion and hung on. Fred's hand gave a twisting jerk on the steering handle. The goblin went corkscrewing upward. In the rearview screen, Conn saw a pink fireball blossom far below. The sound and the shock wave never reached them. The goblin outran them. Dragon and vampire were spiraling away in opposite directions. The radio was loud with voices, and a few of the words were almost printable. A gong began clanging from the command post on top of the mesa on the mainland. "Be quiet, all of you," Clemzaref was bellowing. "And get back from there. Back 3 or 4 miles, close enough so they won't dare use thermonucleus. Take cover behind one of those ridges, where they can't detect you. Then we can start figuring what the Gehenna to do next." That made sense. "And get it settled who's in command of this Darnabrook, while we're at it," Conn thought. He looked into the rear and side view screens, and taking cover immediately made even more sense. 2 more fireballs blossomed, one dangerously close to the dragon. Guns were firing from the mountaintop, 2 big ones, and shells were bursting close to them. He saw a shell land on and another beside one of the enemy gun positions, one 15 mm from the Leicester doors, he supposed. He continued to cling to the stanchion, and the goblin shot straight up, and he was expecting to see the sky blacken and the stars come out when the gunboat leveled and started circling down again. The mountainside, he saw, was sending up a lightning crackling tower of smoke and dust that swelled into a mushroom top. Clemzaref, on the radio, was demanding to know who'd launched that. "We did, sir, Dragon," Stefan Jorison was replying. "We had to get rid of it. We took a hit. Gun turret smashed, Milt Hennant's dead, and Abe Samuels probably will be before I'm done talking, and if we get this crate down in one piece, it'll do for a miracle till a real one happens." "Well, be careful how you shoot those things off," his father implored, from the Leicester doors. "Get one inside the crater and we won't have any spaceport." The Leicester doors vanished behind a mountain range a few miles from the volcano. The dragon, still airborne but in obvious difficulties, was limping after her, and the vampire was covering the withdrawal, firing rapidly but with doubtful effect with her single 90 mm and tossing out counter-missiles. There was another fireball between her and the mountain. Then, when the dragon had followed the Leicester doors to safety, she turned tail and bolted, the goblin following. As they approached the mountains, something the shape of a wrecking car and about half the size passed them going in the opposite direction. As they dropped into the chasm on the other side, another nuclear went off at the volcano. When Conn and Fred left the goblin and boarded the ship, they found Rodney Maxwell, Captain Poole, and a couple of others on the bridge. Charlie Gatworth, the skipper of the vampire, Morgan Gatworth's son, was with them, and, imaged in a screen, so was Clemzaref. One of the other screens, from a pickup on the vampire, showed the dragon lying on her side, her turret crushed and her gun, with the muzzle brake gone, bent upward. A couple of lorries from the Leicester doors were alongside, as Conn watched, a blanket-wrapped body, and then another, were lowered from the disabled gunboat. "Fred, how are you and Charlie fixed for counter-missiles?" Zaref was asking. "Get loaded up with them off the ship, as many as you can carry. Charlie, you go up on top of this ridge above, and take cover where you can watch the mountain. Transmit what you see back to the ship. Fred, you take a position about a quarter way around from where you are now. Don't let them send anything over, but don't start anything yourselves. I'm coming out with everything I can gather up here. I'll be along myself in a couple of hours, and the rest will be stringing in after me. In the meantime, Rodney, you're in command." Well, that settled that. There was one other point, though. "Colonel," Conn said, I assume that this spaceport is occupied by one of these new prospecting companies. We have no right to take it away from them, have we? They fired on us without warning, Karski said. They killed Milt, and it's 10-1 Abe won't live either. We owe them something for that. We do, and we'll pay off. Conn, you assume wrong. This gang's been at the spaceport long enough to get the detection system working and put the defense batteries on ready. They didn't do that since this morning, and up to last evening they neglected to file claim. I'll assume they're on the wrong side of the law. They're outlaws, Conn. All the raids along the East Coast, everybody's blamed them on the Badlands gangs. I'll admit they're responsible for some of it, but I'll bet this gang at the spaceport is doing most of it. That was reasonable. Barathrum was closer to the scene of the worst outlaw depredations than the Badlands, not more than an hour at Mach 2. And nobody ever thought of Barathrum as an outlaw hangout. People rarely thought of Barathrum at all. He liked the idea. The only thing against it was that he wanted so badly to believe it. They brought the body of Milt Hennant aboard, and Abe Samuels, swathed in bandages and immobilized by narcotic injections. A few more of the Dragon's 6-man crew had been injured. Jorison, the skipper, had one trouser leg slit to the belt and his right thigh splintered and bandaged. He took over the Lester Dawes missile controls, which he could manage sitting in one place. Fred Karski and Charlie Gatworth went aboard their craft and lifted out. For a long time, nothing happened. Conn got out the plans of the volcano spaceport and the photomaps of the surrounding area. The principal entrance, the front door of the spaceport, was the crater of the extinct volcano itself. It was ringed, outside, with launching sites and gun positions, and according to the data he had, some of the guns were as big as 250 millimeters. How many outlaws there were to man them was a question a lot of people could get killed trying to answer. The ship docks and shops were down on the level of the crater floor, in caverns, both natural and excavated, that extended far back into the mountain. There were 2 galleries, one above the other, extending entirely around the inside of the crater near the top. Passages from them gave access to the outside gun and missile positions. With a dozen ships the size of the Lester Dawes, about 5,000 men, and a CO who wasn't concerned with trivialities like casualties, they could have taken the place in half an hour. With what they had, trying to fight their way in at the top was out of the question. There was another way in. He had known about it from the beginning, and he was trying desperately to think of a way not to utilize it. It was a tunnel 2 miles long, running into some of the bottom workshops and storerooms back of the ship berths from a big blowhole or small crater at the foot of the mountain. According to the 50-year-old plans, it was big enough to take a gunboat in, and on paper it looked like a royal highway straight to the heart of the enemy's stronghold. To Conn, it looked like a wonderful place to commit suicide. He'd only had a short introductory course, in 1 semester, in military and protective robotics, just enough to give him a foundation if he wanted to go into that branch of the subject later. It was also enough to give him an idea of the sort of booby traps that tunnel could be filled with. He knew what he'd have put into it if he'd been defending that place. Colonel Zarev had sent one last message from Force Command when he lifted off with a flight of recon cars. After that, he maintained a communication blackout. It was an hour and a half before he got close enough to be detected from the outlaw stronghold. Immediately, the volcano began spewing out missiles. Paul hastily took the Lester Dawes 10 miles down the Rift Valley in 60 seconds, while Stefan Jorison put out a nuclear warhead missile and left it circling about where the ship had been. From their respective positions, Fred Karski and Charlie Gatworth filled the airspace midway to the volcano with counter-missiles, each loaded with 4 rockets. There were explosions, fireballs in the air and rising cumulus clouds of varicolored smoke and dust. Only about half the enemy missiles reached the Lester Dawes former position. When their controllers, back at the volcano, couldn't see the ship in their screens, the missiles bunched together. Immediately, Jorison sent his missile up to join them and detonated it. Including his own, 8 nuclear weapons went off together in a single blast that shook the ground like an earthquake and churned the air like a hurricane. Clem Zaref came on screen at once. "Now what did you do?" he demanded. "Blew the whole place up, didn't you?" Rodney Maxwell told him. Zaref laughed. "They might just think they got the ship. All the pickups would be smashed before they could see what really happened. You're about 10 miles south of that. Be with you in a few minutes." They got a screen on for his review pickup. Zaref had with him a dozen Recon cars, some of them under robo-control. 6 gunboats followed, and behind them, to the horizon, other craft were strung out: airboats, troop carriers, and freight scows. They could see enemy missiles approaching in Zaref's front screen. Counter-missiles got most of them, and a couple of pilotless Recon cars were sacrificed. The Leicester doors blasted more missiles as they crossed the top of the mountain range. Then Zaref's car was circling in and entering at one of the ship's open cargo ports. Zaref and Ant's doors got out. "Gunboats are only half an hour behind," Zaref said. "Get some screens onto them, Ants, you know the combinations. Now let's see what kind of a mess we're in here." It was almost a miracle. The way the tottering old man Conn had seen on the dock at Lichfield when he had arrived from Terra had been rejuvenated. The rest of the reinforcements arrived slowly, sending missiles and counter-missiles out ahead of them. Zaref began worrying about the supply. The enemy didn't seem to be running short. By 1300, Conn noted the time incredulously. The battle seemed to have been going on forever. Instead of just 4 hours, the Leicester doors had moved halfway around the volcano and was almost due west of it, and the 8 gunboats were spaced all around the perimeter. Then one stopped transmitting. In the other screens, there was a rising fireball where she had been. The radio was loud with verbal reports. "Poltergeist," Zaref said, naming half a dozen names. 1 or 2 of them had been schoolmates of Conn's at the academy. He knew how he'd feel about it later, but now it simply didn't register. "They are launching missiles faster than we can shoot them down," he said. "That's usually the beginning of the end," Zaref said. "I saw it happen too often during the war. We've got to get inside that place. It's a lot of harmless fun to send contragravity robots out to smash each other, but it doesn't win battles. Battles are won by men, standing with their feet on the ground, using personal weapons." "We'll have to win this one pretty soon," Rodney Maxwell said. "The amount of nuclear energy we've been releasing will be detectable anywhere on the planet by now. The government has a ship like the Leicester doors in commission. If this keeps on, she'll be coming out for a look." "Then we'll have help," Captain Poole said. "We need government help like we need the polka dot fever," Rodney Maxwell said. "If they get in it, they'll claim the spaceport themselves, and we'll have fought a battle for nothing." Well, that was it, then. The spaceport was essential to the Maxwell plan. He'd gotten 7 men killed 8, if the Recon car that was taking Abe Samuels to the hospital in Lichfield didn't make it in time, and it was up to him to see that they hadn't died for nothing. He spread the photo map and the spaceport plans on the chart table. "Look at this," he said. Clem Zaref looked at it. He didn't like it any better than Conn had. He studied the plan for a moment, chewing his cigar. "You know, it's possible they don't know that thing exists," he said, without too much conviction. "You'll be betting the lives of at least 20 men, fewer than that couldn't accomplish anything." "I'll be putting mine on the table along with them," Conn said. "I'll lead them in." He was wishing he hadn't had to say that. He did, though. It was the only thing he could say. "You better pick the men to go with me, Colonel," he continued. "You know them better than I do. We'll need working equipment, too. I have no idea what we may have to take out of the way, inside." "I won't call for volunteers," Zaref said. "I'll pick home guards. They did their volunteering when they joined." "Let me pick one man, Colonel," Ansdor said. "I'll pick me." Chapter 10. They sent a snooper in first. It picked up faint radiation leakage from inactive power units of overhead lights, and nothing else. The tunnel stretched ahead of it, empty, and dark beyond its infrared vision. After it had gone a mile without triggering anything, the jeep followed, Ants Dawes piloting and Conn at the snooper controls watching what it transmitted back. The two lorries followed, loaded with men and equipment, and another jeep brought up the rear. They had cut screen and radio communication with the outside. They weren't even using inter-vehicle communication. At length, the snooper emerged into a big cavern, swinging slowly to scan it. The walls and ceiling were rough and irregular. It was natural instead of excavated. Only the floor had been leveled smooth. There were a lot of things in it, machinery and vehicles, all battered and in poor condition, dusty and cobwebbed, the spaceport junk heap. A passage, still large enough for one of the gunboats, led deeper into the mountain toward the crater. They sent the snooper in and, after a while, followed. They came to other rectangular, excavated caverns. On the plans, they were marked as storerooms. Cases and crates, indeterminate shrouded objects, some had never been disturbed, but here and there they found evidence of recent investigation. Beyond was another passage, almost as wide as the mall in Lichfield. Even the Leicester doors could have negotiated it. According to the plans, it ran straight out to the ship docks and the open crater beyond. Ants turned the jeep into a side passage, and Conn recalled the snooper and sent it ahead. On the plan, it led to another natural cavern, half its width shown as level with the entrance. The other half was a pit, marked as 60 feet deep. Above this and just under the ceiling, several passages branched out in different directions. The snooper reported visible light ahead, fluoroelectric light from one of the upper passages, and firelight from the pit. The air analyzer reported wood smoke and a faint odor of burning oil. He sent the snooper ahead, tilting it to look down into the pit. A small fire was burning in the center. Around it, in a circle, some 150 people, including a few women and children, sat, squatted or reclined. A low hum of voices came out of the sound box. "Who the blazes are they?" Ants whispered. "I can't see any way they could have gotten down there." They were in rags, and they weren't armed. There wasn't so much as a knife or a pistol among them. Conn motioned the lorries and the other jeep forward. "Prisoners," he said. "I think they were hauled down here on a scow, shoved off, and left when the fighting started." "Cover me," he told the men in the lorries. "I'm going down and talk to them." Somebody below must have heard something. As Ants took the jeep over and started floating it down, the circle around the fire began moving, the women and children being pushed to the rear and the men gathering up clubs and other chance weapons. By the time the jeep grounded, the men in the pit were standing defensively in front of the women and children. They were all dirty and ragged. The men were unshaven. There was a tall man with a grizzled beard, in greasy coveralls, another man with a black beard and an old Space Navy uniform, his head bandaged with a dirty and blood-caked rag, another in the same uniform, wearing a cap on which the Terran Federation insignia had been replaced by the emblem of transcontinent and overseas ship lines and the words Chief Engineer. And beside the tall man with the grey beard, was a girl in baggy trousers and a torn smock. Like the others, she was dirty, but in spite of the rags and filth, Conn saw that she was beautiful. Black hair, dark eyes, an impudently tilted nose. They all looked at him in hostility that gradually changed to perplexity and then hope. "Who are you?" the tall man with the grey beard asked. "You're none of this gang here." "Lichfield Exploration and Salvage, I'm Conn Maxwell." That meant nothing. None of them had been near a news screen lately. "What's going on topside?" the man with the bandaged head and the 4 stripes on his sleeve asked. "There was firing, artillery and nucleus, and they herded us down here. Have you cleaned the bloody murderers out?" "We're working on it," Conn said. "I take it they aren't friends of yours?" Foolish question of the year. They all made that evident. "They took my ship," They murdered my first officer and half my crew and passengers. They burned our home and killed our servants, the girl said. They kidnapped my father and me. They've been keeping us here as slaves. It's the Blackie Police gang, the tall man with the grey beard said. They've been making us work for them, converting a blasted tub of a contragravity ship into a spacecraft. I beg your pardon, Captain Nichols, she was a fine ship for her intended purpose. You're Captain Nichols? Ants Dawes exclaimed. Of the Harriet Bairn? That's right. The Harriet Bairn's here, they've been making us work on her, to convert her to an interplanetary craft, of all idiotic things. My name's Yves Jockmorn, the man with the grey beard said. I'm a retired hyperspace maintenance engineer. I had a little business at Waterville, buying, selling and rebuilding agricultural machinery. This gang found out about me, they raided and burned our village and carried me and my daughter, Sylvie, away. We've been working for them for the last 4 months, tearing Captain Nichols' ship down and armoring her with collapsium. How many pirates are there here? That started an argument. Nobody was quite sure. 250 seemed to be the highest estimate, which Conn decided to play safe by accepting. You get us out of here, Yves Jockmorn was saying. All we want is a chance at them. How about arms? You can't do much with clubs and fists. Don't worry about that, we know where to get arms. The treasure house, where they store their loot. There's plenty of arms and ammunition, and anything else you can think of. They've used us to help stow the stuff, we know where it is. Ants, you remember those scows we saw, in the big room before we came to the broad passage? Take 4 men in the jeep, have them lift 2 of them and bring them here. Then, you get out to the end of the tunnel and call the Leicester doors. Tell them what's happened, tell them they can get gunboats all the way in, and wait to guide them when they arrive. When Ants turned and climbed into the jeep, he asked Yves Jockmorn, why does this Paulus want an interplanetary ship? He's crazy. Jockmorn swore. Paranoid, megalomaniac. He talks of organizing all the pirates and outlaws on the planet into one band and making himself king. He's heard that there are Space Navy superweapons on Poictesme, I suppose there are, at that, and he wants to get a lot of planet busters and hellburners and annihilators. He lowered his voice. Captain Nichols and I were going to fix up something that'd blow the Harriet Bairn up as soon as he got her out of atmosphere. He talked for a while to Jockmorn and his daughter Sylvie, and to Nichols and the chief engineer, whose name was Vibart. There was evidently nothing else at the spaceport of which a spaceship could be built, but there were foundries and rolling mills and a collapsed matter producer. The Harriet Bairn was gutted, half torn down, and half armored with new collapsium-plated sheet steel. It might be possible to continue the work on her and take her to space. Then the 2 scows floated over the top of the pit and began letting down. They got the prisoners into them, the combat-effective men in one and the women and children in the other. At the top, he took over the remaining jeep, getting Jockmorn, his daughter, and the 2 contragravity ship officers in with him. Up to the top, Jockmorn said. Take the middle passage, and turn right at the next intersection. As they approached the section where the pirates stored their loot, the sound of guns and explosions grew louder, and they began picking up radio and screen signals, all of which were scrambled and incomprehensible. The pirates, in different positions, talking among themselves. With all that, it ought to be safe to use their own communication equipment, nobody would notice it. The treasure room looked like a giant pack rat's nest. Cases and crates of merchandise, bales, boxes, barrels. Machinery. Household and industrial robots. The prisoners piled out of the 2 scows and began rummaging. Somebody found a case of cigarettes and smashed it open. In a moment, cartons were being tossed around and opened, and everybody was smoking. The pirates evidently hadn't issued any tobacco rations to their prisoners. And they found arms and ammunition, began ripping open cases, handing out rifles, pistols, submachine guns. The prisoners grabbed them even more hungrily than the cigarettes. Sylvie Jockmorn took charge of the ammunition. She had 3 men opening boxes for her, while she passed out boxes of cartridges and made sure that everybody had ammunition to fit their weapons. A ragged man who might have been a farm tramp or a rich planter before his capture had gotten a bale of cloth open and was tossing rags around while the chief engineer inspected weapons and showed people how to clean out the Cosmo line and fill their spare magazines. Conn collected a few of his own party. "Let's look these robots over," he said. "Find about half a dozen we can load with blasting explosive and send ahead of us on contragravity." They found several: an electric light servicer, a couple of wall and window washers, a serving robot that looked as if it had come from a restaurant, and an all-purpose robo-janitor. In the passage outside, they began loading the lorries with bricks of ironite and packages of cataclysmite, packing all the scrap iron and other junk around the explosives that they could. As soon as they had weapons, the prisoners came swarming out, making more noise than was necessary and a good deal more than was safe. Sylvie Jockmorn, with a submachine gun slung from one shoulder and a canvas bag of spare magazines from the other, came over to see what he was doing. "Well, look what you're doing to him," she mock-reproached. "That's a dirty trick to play on a little robot." He grinned at her. "You and my mother would get along. She always treats robots like people." "Well, they are, sort of. They aren't alive, at least. I don't think they are, but they do what you tell them, and they learn tricks, and they have personalities." That was true. He didn't think robots were alive, either, though biophysics professors tended to become glibly evasive when pinned down to defining life. Robots could learn, if you used the term loosely enough. And any robot with more than 500 hours service picked up a definite and often exasperating personality. "I've been working with them, and tearing them down and fixing them, ever since I was in pigtails," she added. The half-dozen natural leaders among the prisoners, Jockmorn and his daughter, the 2 Harriet Bairn officers, and a couple of others, bent over the photo-printed plans Conn had, located their position, and told him as much as they could about what lay ahead. Sylvie Jockmorn could handle robots. She would ride in the front seat of the Jeep while he piloted. Vibart, the chief engineer, and Eve Jockmorn would ride behind. Nichols would ride in the scow with the fighting men. One lorry of his own party would follow the Jeep, the other would bring up the rear. He snapped on the screen and punched the ship combination. Stefan Jorison appeared in it. "Hi, Conn. You all right?" He raised his voice. "Conn's on screen." His father appeared at Jorison's shoulder and, a moment later, Clem Zaref. "Well, we're in, all right," he said. "We just picked up an army, too." He swung the Jeep to get the crowd in the pickup, explaining who they were. "Did you hear from Ants?" "Yes, he just screened in," Rodney Maxwell said. "He said a gunboat can get in." "That's right, clear into the crater." "Well, we're going to put 3 of them inside," Zaref told him. "Werewolf, zombie, and Giro. And a troop carrier with 50 men, flamethrowers, portable machine guns, bomb launchers, regular special weapons section." "What can you do where you are?" "Here? Nothing. We're going to work around to the other side of the crater, and then find a vertical shaft and go up topside and make as much disturbance as we can." "That's it." Zaref approved. "Pull them off balance. As soon as we get in, we'll go straight to the top. Look for us in about an hour. It's going to take time getting to the tunnel mouth without being spotted from above." He lifted the Jeep and started off. The lorry, and the scows and the other lorry, followed. The snooper and the bomb robots went ahead like a pack of hunting dogs. They went through great chambers, dark and silent and bulking with dusty machines. Jockmorn explained that the prisoners had never gotten into this section. The Harriet Bairn was a mile or so to their right. Conn turned left, when the noise of firing from outside became plainer. A foundry. A machine shop which seemed to have been abandoned in the middle of some rush job that hadn't really been necessary. They came to a place even the snooper couldn't enter, choked to the ceiling with dead vegetation, hydroponic seed plants that had been left untended to grow wild and die. They emerged into outside light, in vast caves a mile high and open onto the crater, and looked across the floor that had been leveled and vitrified to the other side, 3.5 miles away. He didn't know whether to be more awed by the original eruption that had formed the crater or by the engineering feat of carving these docks and ship berths, big enough for the hugest hyperspaceship, into it. At first, he had been afraid of getting into position too soon before the task force from outside could profit by the diversion. Then he began to worry about the time it was taking to get halfway around the crater. He could hear artillery thundering continuously above. Except at the very beginning of the battle, there had been little gunfire. He wondered if both sides were running out of lift and drive missiles, or if the fighting had gotten too close for anybody to risk using nuclear weapons. He was also worrying about the women and children among the released prisoners. Why did the pirates bother with them? He asked Sylvie. They used the women and some of the old men to do housekeeping chores for them, she said. Mostly, though, they were hostages. If the men didn't work, Poictesme threatened to punish the women and children. I wasn't doing any housework, I'm too good a mechanic. I was helping on the ship. Well, what'll I do with them when the fighting starts? I can't take them into battle. You'll have to, it'll be the safest place for them. You can't leave them anywhere and risk having them recaptured. That means we'll have to detach some men to cover them, and that'll cut our striking force down. He whistled at the sound pickup of his screen and told his father about it. What do I do with these people, anyhow? You're the officer in command, Conn, his father told him. Your decision. How soon can you attack? We're almost through to the crater. There's a vertical shaft right above us, and a lot of noise at the top. We'll send up a couple of bomb robots to clear things at the shaft head and follow with everything we have. Non-combatants and all? He nodded. Only thing we can do. An old quotation occurred to him. If you want to make an omelette, you have to break eggs. He wondered who'd said that in the first place. One of the old pre-atomic conquerors, maybe Hitler. No, Hitler would have said, if you want to make sauerkraut, you have to chop cabbage. Maybe it was Caesar. We'd better send Gumshoe Gus up, first, Sylvie suggested. You handle him. Take a quick look around, and then pull him back. We'll need him later. It was the first time he'd ever caught himself calling a robot him, instead of it. He thought for a second, and added, give your father and Mr. Vibart the controls for the 2 window washers, you handle the snooper. He gave more instructions, Yves Jockmorn to turn his bomb robot right, Vibart to turn his left, the 2 lorries to follow the jeep up the shaft, the scows to follow. Then he leaned back and looked at the screens that had been rigged under the top of the jeep. A circle of light appeared in one, growing larger and brighter as the snooper approached the top of the shaft. 2 more came on as the bomb robots followed. All right, follow me, he said into the intervehicle radio, and started the jeep slowly up the shaft. The snooper popped out of the shaft, onto a gallery that had been cut into the solid rock, 50 feet high and 150 across, with a low parapet on the outside and the mile-deep crater beyond. There were a few grounded aircars and lorries in sight, and a medium airboat rested 100 or so feet on the right of the shaft opening. 15 or 20 men were clustered around it, with a lifter loaded with ammunition. They looked like any crowd of farm tramps. Suddenly, one of them saw the snooper, gave a yell, and fired at it with a rifle. Sylvie pulled it back into the shaft. Her father and the chief engineer sent the 2 bomb robots up onto the gallery. The right-hand robot sped at the airboat. The last thing Conn saw in its screen was a face, bearded and villainous and contorted with fright, looking out the pilot's window of the airboat. Then it went dead, and there was a roar from above. On the other side, several men were firing straight at the pickup of the other robot. It went dead, too, and there was a second explosion. In the communication screen, somebody was yelling, "Give them another one for Milt Hennant," and his father was urging him to get in fast, before they recovered. In peace or war, screen communication was a wonderful thing. The only trouble was that it let in too many kibitzers. The gallery, when the jeep emerged onto it, was empty except for casualties, a few still alive. The side of the airboat was caved in, the lifter load of ammunition had gone up with the bomb. He moved the jeep to the right of the shaft and waited for the vehicles behind him, suffering a brief indecision. Never divide your force in the presence of the enemy. There had been generals who had done that and gotten away with it, but they'd had names like Fox Travis and Robert E. Lee and Napoleon, that was who'd made that crack about omelets. They'd known what they were doing. He was playing this battle by ear. There was a lot of shouting ahead to the right. That meant live pirates, a deplorable situation which ought to be corrected at once. The communication screen was noisy. Now, his father had gotten to the top gallery with the 3 gun cutters, and was meeting resistance. He formed his column, his jeep and one of the lorries in front, the scows next, and the second lorry behind, and started around the gallery counterclockwise, the snoopers and the 3 remaining bomb robots ahead. They began running into resistance almost at once. Bullets spattered on the armor glass in front of him, spalling it and blotching it with metal until he found that he could steer better by the showback of his view pickup. He used that until the pickup was shot out. Then his father began wanting to know, from the communication screen, what was going on and where he was. A bomb or something went off directly under the jeep, bouncing it almost to the ceiling. He found that it was impossible to lift it again after it settled to the floor of the gallery, and they all piled out to fight on foot. Somers and his gang from the number 1 lorry were also afoot. Their vehicle had been disabled. He saw them lifting wounded into one of the scows. They blew up the light service robot to clear a nest of pirates who had taken cover ahead of them. They sent the robo-janitor up a side passage and exploded it in a missile launching position on the outside of the mountain, that produced a tremendous explosion. They began running out of cartridges, and had to stop and glean more from enemy casualties. They expended their last bomb robot, the restaurant server, to break up another pirate resistance point. At length he found himself, with Sylvie and her father and one of the home guardsmen from Somers' lorry, lying behind an aircar somebody had knocked out with a bazooka, with 2 dead pirates for company and a dozen distressingly live ones ahead behind an improvised barricade. Behind, there was frantic firing. The rigard seemed to have run into trouble, probably from some gang that had come down from the upper level. He wondered what his father was doing with the gunboats. Since abandoning the jeep, he had lost his only means of contact. Suddenly, the men in front jumped up from their barricade and came running toward him. Been reinforced, now they're counterattacking. His rifle was empty. He drew his pistol and shot one of them, and then he saw that they were throwing up their hands and yelling for quarter. This was something new. He looked around quickly, to make sure none of the liberated prisoners except Jock Morn and his daughter were around, and then called to a couple of his own men to come up and help him. While they were relieving the pirates of their pistol belts and cartridge bandoliers, more came up, their hands over their heads, herded by a combat car from which Tom Brangwyn covered them with a pair of 12mm machine guns. Tom hadn't put in an appearance before he had taken his commando force into the tunnel. He hadn't even known the chief of company police was on Barathrum. "Well, nice seeing you," he greeted. "How did you get in?" "Over the top," Brangwyn told him. "Everything's caved in on the other side. We have a quarter of the top gallery, and half of this one. Your father's cleaning up above. Clem's got some men working along the outside." Sylvie was tugging at his arm. "Hey, look! Look at that," she was clamoring. "Who's she belong to?" He looked, The Lestadors was coming over the edge of the crater. "She's ours," he said. "It's all over but the mopping up. And counting the egg breakage." Chapter 11. The shooting died down to occasional rattles of small arms, usually followed by yells for quarter. An explosion thundered from across the crater. The Lestadors fired her big guns a few times. A machine gun stuttered. A pistol banged, far away. It took 2 hours before all the pirates had been hunted out of hiding and captured, or killed if found by their former captives, who were accepting no surrender whatever. Blackie Paulus had been one of the latter. He had been found, his clothes in rags and covered with dirt and grease, hiding under a machine in one of the shops back of the dock in which the Harriet Bearn was being rebuilt. He had tried to claim that he was one of the pirates' prisoners who had eluded the roundup at the beginning of the battle and had been hiding there since. As soon as the real prisoners saw and recognized him, they had fallen upon him and clubbed, kicked and stamped him out of any resemblance to humanity. At that, what he got was probably only a fraction of what he deserved. The egg breakage had been heavy, and not at all confined to the bad eggs. A third gunboat, the Banshee, had been destroyed with all hands during the final attack from outside. In addition, a dozen men had been killed during the fighting in the galleries. Everybody was shocked, except Clem Zaref, who had been in battles before. He was surprised that the casualties had been so light. At first glance, the spaceport looked like a handsome prize of victory. The docks and workshops were all in good condition. At worst, they only needed cleaning up. There was a collapsium plant, with its own mass energy converter. There were foundries and machine shops and forging shops and a rolling mill, almost completely robotic. At first, Conn thought that it might be possible to build a hyperdrive ship here, without having to go to Poictesme at all. Closer examination disabused him of this hope. There was nothing of which the framework of a ship could be built, and no way of producing heavy structural steel. The rolling mill was good enough to turn out 1/8-inch sheet material which when plated with a few micromicrons of collapsium would be as good as 100 feet of lead against space radiations, but that was the ship's skin. A ship needed a skeleton, too. The only thing to do was go on with the Harriet Bearn. It was sunset before he finished his tour of inspection and let his jeep down in a vehicle haul off the lower gallery outside what had originally been the Spaceport Officers Club. It was crowded, and a victory celebration seemed to be getting underway. He saw his father with Eve Jockmorn, Sylvie, Tom Brangwyn, and Captain Nichols. Nichols had gotten clean clothes from the pirate store of loot, and had bathed and shaved. So had Jockmorn, though he had contented himself with trimming his beard. It took him a second or so to recognize the young lady in feminine garb as his erstwhile battle comrade, Sylvie. "Well, our pay goes on from the day we were captured," Nichols was saying. "My instructions are to resume command of the ship. Tomorrow, they're sending a party out to go over her." Conn stopped short. "What's this about the ship?" Captain Nichols was in screen contact with his company's office in Storisend, Rodney Maxwell said. "They're continuing him in command of her." But we took that ship. We lost 3 gunboats and about 25 men." "She still belongs to Transcontinent and overseas," his father said. "That's been the law on stolen property as long as there's been any law." Of course, he should have known that. Did know it, just didn't think. "We broke an awful lot of eggs for no armlet, fought a battle for nothing." "Well, of course, I'm prejudiced," Sylvie said, "but I don't think getting us out of the hands of that bloodthirsty maniac and his cutthroats was nothing." "Wiping out the Paulus gang wasn't nothing, Conn," Tom Brangwyn said. "You got no idea at all how bad things were, the last couple of years." "I know. I'm sorry." He was ashamed of himself. "But I needed a ship, and now we have no ship at all." "A ship means something to you?" Eve Jockmorn asked. "Yes." He told him why. "If we could get to Poictesme, we could build a hypership of our own, and get our brandy and things to markets where we could get a decent price for them. I know. I was in and out of Storysend on these owner-captain tramps for a couple of years before I decided to retire and settle here, Jockmorn said. The profit on a cargo of Poictesme brandy on Terra or Balder is over 1,000%. Well, don't give up too soon, Nichols advised. You can't keep the Harriet Bairn, of course, but you're entitled to prize money on her, and that ought to buy you something you could build a spaceship out of. That's right, Jockmorn said. Everything else besides the frame can be made here. Look, these pirates burned me out, except for the money I have in the bank. I lost everything, home, business and all. As soon as I can find a place for Sylvie to stay, I'll come back and go to work for your company building a spaceship. And a lot of the men who are working here are farm tramps and drifters. One job's as good as another as long as they get paid for it. And I know a few good men in Storysend, engineers, who'd be glad for a job, too. You think it would be all right with Mother and Flora if Sylvie stayed with us? Conn asked. Of course it would, they'd be glad to have her. Rodney Maxwell turned to Eve Jockmorn. Let's consider that fixed up. Now, suppose you and I go into Storysend, and... **********. The transcontinent and overseas people arrived at Barathrum Spaceport the next morning, a rear-rank vice president, a front-rank legal eagle, and 3 engineers. They were horrified at what they saw. The Harriet Bairn had been gutted. Bulkheads and decks had been ripped out and relocated incomprehensibly, the bridge and the control room under it were gone, she had been stripped to her framework, and the whole underside was sheathed in shimmering collapsium. Great goo, the vice president almost howled. That isn't our ship. That's the Harriet Bairn, her captain said. She looks a little ragged now, but... You helped these pirates do this to her. If I hadn't, they'd have cut my throat and gotten somebody else to help them. My throat's more valuable to me than the ship is to you. I can't get anybody to build me a new one. Well, understand, one of the engineers said, they were converting her into an interplanetary ship. It wouldn't cost much to finish the job. We need an interplanetary ship like we need a hole in the head. The vice president turned to Rodney Maxwell. Just how much prize money do you think you're entitled to for this wreck? I wouldn't know, that's up to Sturber, Flynn and Chen Wong. Up to the court, if we can settle it any other way. You mean you'd litigate about this, the lawyer demanded, and began to laugh. If we have to. Look, if you people don't want her, sign her over to Litchfield Exploration and Salvage. But if you do want her, you'll have to pay for her. We'll give you 20,000 souls, the lawyer said. We don't want to be tight-fisted. After all, you fought a gang of pirates and lost some men and a couple of boats, we have some moral obligation to you. But you'll have to realize that this ship, in her present state, is practically valueless. The collapsium on her is worth twice that, and the engines are worth even more, Jockmorn said. I worked on them. The discussion ended there. By mid-afternoon, Luther Chenwong, the junior partner of the law firm, arrived from Storysend with a couple of engineers of his own. Reporters began arriving, both sides were anxious to keep them away from the ship. Conn took care of them, assisted by Sylvie, who had rummaged an even more attractive costume out of what she called the loot cellar. The reporters all used up a lot of film footage on her. And the Forces office gang arrived from Force Command, bitterly critical of the value of the spaceport against its cost in lives and equipment. Brangwyn and Zaref returned to Force Command with them. A planetary air patrol ship arrived and removed the captured pirates. The liberated prisoners were airlifted to Litchfield. The third day after the battle, Conn and his father and Sylvie and her father flew to Litchfield. To Conn's surprise, Flora greeted him cordially, and Wade Lucas, rather stiffly, congratulated him. Maybe it was as Tom Brangwyn had said, he hadn't been on Poictesme in the last 4 or 5 years and didn't know how bad things had gotten. His mother seemed to think he had won the Battle of Barathrum single-handed. He was even more surprised and gratified that Flora made friends with Sylvie immediately. His mother, however, regarded the engineer's daughter with badly concealed hostility, and seemed to doubt that Sylvie was the kind of girl she wanted her son getting involved with. Outwardly, of course, she was quite gracious. Rodney Maxwell and Eve Jockmorn flew to Storesend the next morning, both more optimistic about finding a ship than Conn thought the circumstances warranted. Conn stayed at home for the next few days, luxuriating in idleness. He and Sylvie tore down his mother's household robots and built sound sensors into them, keying them to respond to their names and to a few simple commands, and including recorded voice responses in a thick Shishan accent. All the smart people on Terra, he explained, had Shishan humanoid servants. His mother was delighted. Robots that would answer when she spoke to them were a lot more companionable. She didn't seem to think, however, that Sylvie's mechanical skills were ladylike accomplishments. Nice girls, Litchfield model, weren't quite so handy with a spot welder. That was what Conn liked about Sylvie, she was like the girls he'd known at the university. They were strolling after dinner, down the mall. The air was sharp and warned that autumn had definitely arrived. The many brilliant stars, almost as bright as the moon of Terra, were coming out in the dusk. Conn, this thing about Merlin, she began. Do you really believe in it? Ever since Dad and I came to Poictesme, I've been hearing about it, but it's just a story, isn't it? He was tempted to tell her the truth, and sternly put the temptation behind him. Of course there's a Merlin, Sylvie, and it's going to do wonderful things when we find it. He looked down the starlit mall ahead of him. Somebody, maybe Lester Dawes and Morgan Gatworth and Lorenzo Menards, had gotten things finished and cleaned up. The pavement was smooth and unbroken, the litter had vanished. It's done wonderful things already, just because people started looking for it, he said. Some of these days, they're going to realize that they had Merlin all along and didn't know it. There was a faint humming from somewhere ahead, and he was wondering what it was. Then they came to the long escalators, and he saw that they were running. Why, look! They got them fixed. They're running. Sylvie grinned at him and squeezed his arm. I get you, chum, she said. Of course there's a Merlin. Maybe he didn't have to tell her the truth. When they returned to the house, his mother greeted him. Conn, your father's been trying to get you ever since you went out. Call him, right away, Ritz-Gartner Hotel, in Storesend. It's something about a ship. It took a little time to get his father on screen. He was excited and happy. Hi, Conn, we have one, he said. What kind of a ship? You know her. The Harriet Bairn. That he hadn't expected. Something off Mothball Row that would have to be flown to Barathrum and torn down and completely rebuilt, but not the one that was there already, partly finished. How the dickens did you wangle that? Oh, it was Eve's idea, to start with. He knew about her, the T&OS been losing money on her for years. He said if they had to pay prize money on her and then either restore her to original condition or finish the job and build a spaceship they didn't want, it would almost bankrupt the company. They got up as high as 50,000 souls for prize money and we just laughed at them. So we made a proposition of our own. We proposed organizing a new company, subsidiary to both L, E, and S, and T, and O, to engage in interplanetary shipping, both companies to assign their equity in the Harriet Bairn to the new company, the work of completing her to be done at our spaceport and the labor cost to be shared. This would give us our spaceship, and get T&O off the hook all around. Everybody was for it except the president of T&O, know anything about him. Conn shook his head. His father continued. Name's Jethro Sastraman. He could play Scrooge in Christmas Carol without any makeup at all. He hasn't had a new idea since he got out of college, and that was while the war was still going on. Preposterous, utterly visionary and impractical, his father mimicked. Fortunately, a majority of the big stockholders didn't agree. They finally bullied him into agreeing. We're calling the new company Alpha Interplanetary. We have an application for charter in, and that'll go through almost automatically. Who's going to be the president of this new company? You know him. Character named Rodney Maxwell. Eve is going to be vice president in charge of operations. He's flying to Barathrum tomorrow or the next day with a gang of technicians we're recruiting. T&O are giving us Clyde Nichols and Mac Vibart, and a lot of men from their shipyard. I'm staying here in Storisend. We're opening an office here. By this time next week, we're all going to wish we'd been born quintuplets. And Conn Maxwell, I suppose, will be an influential non-office holding stockholder. That's right. Just like in L, E, and S.